When most of us think about schools, we picture crowded hallways, loud teenagers, and the constant hum of daytime activity. We see teachers writing on whiteboards, friends talking by their lockers, and coaches shouting instructions on the gym floor. It is a place of learning and energy. But there is a completely different version of these buildings that very few people ever get to see. It is the school that exists after 10 o'clock at night. When the last teacher turns off their desk lamp, locks their classroom door, and drives home, a heavy silence settles over the empty corridors. For the night custodians, this is when their workday actually begins. It is a lonely and often unsettling job. You walk down corridors that are usually filled with the loud chatter of hundreds of young students. But now, the only thing you can hear is the hum of your own thoughts. You are completely alone in a massive structure that was built to hold thousands of people. Every single step you take echoes down the hallways. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a threat. Most night custodians will tell you that you eventually get used to the quiet. You learn to tune out the strange noises and focus on your work. But sometimes the noises are not just the building settling. Sometimes something is down there with you. Our first story begins with a man who worked as an overnight custodian at an old middle school. He spent almost 5 years working the late shift. His schedule was always the same. He would arrive at the school, clock in around 10 o'clock at night, and work until just before the sun came up. In the beginning, he actually enjoyed the work. He was a quiet guy who liked to be left alone, and this job was perfect for that. He did not have to deal with noisy kids running through the hallways. He could just put his headphones in, push his cleaning cart, and do his job in peace. But as the months turned into years, he started to notice how different the school felt at night compared to during the day. It wasn't just quiet, it felt dead. The building itself was quite old, having been built back in the 1950s. The walls would groan, the heating pipes would knock, and the roof would creak whenever the wind blew outside. When you are the only person in a 3-story building, your brain starts to play tricks on you. A locker door upstairs would suddenly pop open with a loud click, or a draft would blow a piece of paper across the floor. For the most part, he learned to ignore these little things. But there was one specific area of the school that he could never get used to, and that was the basement. The basement of this middle school was not a nice finished area. Because the school was built in the 1950s, the basement was basically a massive concrete maze that ran under about half of the entire campus. It was dark, damp, and smelled constantly of wet cement and old, musty paper. The ceilings were low, with thick rusted pipes and tangled black wires hanging down just above your head. The basement was divided into several different storage rooms. Some of these rooms were filled with towering piles of wooden desks. Others were packed with heavy cardboard boxes containing outdated textbooks that had not been opened in 30 years. The lighting down there was terrible. The old fluorescent bulbs would buzz loudly and flicker constantly, and half of them did not even work at all. If you had to go down there, you always had to bring a powerful flashlight. On his very first week on the job, one of the older custodians had pulled him aside. The older man had a serious look on his face when he told him to avoid the basement unless it was absolutely necessary. He joked that the basement was haunted, but our custodian noticed that the older man never laughed with his eyes. He realized that the veterans on the staff genuinely avoided that basement. Even just walking past the heavy wooden door that led downstairs gave our custodian a cold, uneasy feeling, so he avoided it whenever possible. For the first 2 years of his employment, he managed to keep that promise. But one night, his luck finally ran out. He was looking at the daily task list his supervisor had taped to his cart. At the bottom of the list was a note. It instructed him to go down to the basement and bring up several stacks of metal folding chairs for an event the following morning. As soon as he read the note, his stomach dropped. He stood at the top of the basement stairs for a long time, holding the heavy brass handle of the door, debating if he could ask his supervisor if it could wait until morning. But he did not want to look lazy. So he grabbed his flashlight, unlocked the door, and stepped onto the concrete stairs. The door clicked shut behind him, cutting off the warm light from the main hallway. The stairwell echoed with every step he took, like his boots were way too loud. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he reached out and flipped the main light switch. A few of the fluorescent lights down the long hallway buzzed to life, leaving most of the hallway in darkness. The smell of wet cement was overwhelming. He turned on his flashlight and started walking. The chairs were supposed to be in the second storage room on the left. The first room was full of old desks, piled all the way to the ceiling. The second door was half rusted, and it squealed like nails on a chalkboard when he pulled it open. Inside, the room smelled of dust and wood polish. The folding chairs were stacked against the wall in uneven piles. He bent down and started pulling them out, trying to carry as many as he could at once, so he would not have to make so many trips. He had just picked up 4 when he froze. From somewhere out in the hallway, he heard a soft dragging sound, like someone was slowly sliding their shoe across the concrete floor. He held his breath, still bent over with the chairs in his arms. Listening as hard as he could, the sound stopped. He slowly stood up and peeked his head out into the hallway, shining the flashlight both ways. The beam cut through the dark, but there was nothing there. His heart was thumping in his ears. He stood there for what felt like forever, before finally telling himself it was probably just the pipes, or maybe he had shifted a chair without realizing it. He carried the first load out into the hallway and toward the stairs. As he walked, he suddenly felt a cold draft against his face. It was so out of place that it made him stop mid-step. The basement was always warm and stale with no windows. This felt like standing next to an open freezer. He shined his light up and down the hallway, but nothing looked different. He shook it off, set the chairs at the bottom of the stairs, and went back for more. When he walked into the storage room again, something felt off. The stack of chairs looked different, like they had shifted while he was gone. He frowned at them, trying to remember exactly how they had been leaning. He finally told himself he was just being paranoid, and picked up another load. This time, as he turned to leave, he heard it again, a thump followed by a scraping sound. It came from farther down the basement hallway. His flashlight beam shook in his hand as he aimed it that way. About 20 feet down, one of the classroom doors that should have been closed tight was cracked open. His stomach dropped. He knew he had not touched that door. The school was locked up every night, and no one was supposed to be there except him. He stood frozen in the doorway of the storage room, staring at that cracked door. Every part of him screamed to drop the chairs and run upstairs, but he just stood there. He told himself that maybe the door had come loose, or maybe when he opened another door, the air pressure had shifted. He clung to those excuses like a lifeline. He carried the chairs quickly to the stairwell, then came back with his flashlight in one hand, empty-handed this time. The cracked door was still there, open just enough for someone to peek out. His throat went dry. He crept toward it slowly, each step echoing. When he was close, he called out, "Hello, anyone down here?" His voice cracked and it sounded small in the big empty basement. No answer. He swallowed hard, then pushed the door open fast with his free hand and shined the flashlight inside. The room was completely and utterly empty, just shells of dusty science equipment, boxes stacked high, cobwebs in the corners. He stepped inside for a second, heart racing, listening for any sound. That is when he heard it again, a dragging shuffle, but this time it was behind him in the hallway. He spun around and pointed the flashlight with the beam cutting down the corridor. Nothing, just shadows and concrete, but he felt it. That heavy pressure you get when you know you are being watched. His skin prickled all over. He did not care about the chairs anymore. He backed up slowly, keeping the flashlight aimed down the hallway, and made his way toward the stairwell. When he got to the stairs, he grabbed the chairs he had left and carried them up 2 steps at a time. He did not stop until he was back in the main hallway upstairs, gasping for breath. He leaned against the wall, sweating even though the school was cold. He told himself he was imagining things. Maybe it had been rats or water pipes, but he could not explain the cracked door. He locked the stairwell door behind me, even though he was not supposed to, and he did not go back down for the rest of the night. A week later, he was mopping the hallway right above the basement stairs when he heard it again. 3 loud bangs, evenly spaced, like someone hitting the wall with their fist. The mop slipped out of his hand, water dripping onto the tiles. He froze and listened. Then he heard the basement door rattle like someone had shoved it from the other side. His blood went cold. He did not open it. He stood there gripping the mop handle until the sound stopped. After that, he refused to go down into the basement alone. If anything needed to come up, He would wait until another custodian was there. He never told the others what he heard because he knew they would either laugh or tell me it was the so-called ghost. But he knows what he felt and he knows what he heard. To this day, when he thinks about those slow dragging footsteps behind me, he feels sick to his stomach. It is a memory that has stayed with him for years, and it is the main reason why he eventually decided to leave that school district altogether. Our second story takes us to a high school where a custodian worked for 3 years. He was the newest guy on the team, so most of the time he got stuck with the overnight shifts. The building was huge with 4 floors and 2 gymnasiums, and at night when it was empty, it felt like a giant maze. The rule was to go floor by floor, room by room, turning off lights, emptying trash, and locking doors. It usually took the whole night to cover everything, and if you tried to rush, you would miss something. One Friday night, he was working alone because one of the other custodians had called out sick. Normally, they worked in pairs, so he was not used to being the only one on duty. At first, the shift was normal. He started on the first floor, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, and mopping the hallways. The lights in some of the old corridors flickered, which made the shadows jump around, but he told himself it was just the building settling. Around midnight, he made his way up to the 3rd floor. That floor always gave him a bad feeling because it was quieter than the others. It had a lot of older classrooms that were not used anymore. Some permanently locked, and others were just storage rooms filled with dusty books, broken furniture, and old lab equipment. As he walked down the hallway, he passed the lockers. The metallic click of the doors and the echo of his boots against the tiles made him jump a few times. He kept reminding himself it was normal. He was halfway through mopping one of the main hallways when he noticed a door about 20 feet away was open. That struck him immediately because he had already checked all the rooms earlier in the evening and every door had been locked. His first instinct was to walk past it quickly and ignore it. But something made him stop. He set his mop against the wall and walked over slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The door was one of those old wooden classroom doors with a square glass window. He pushed it open slowly, shining his flashlight inside. The room looked empty. The desks were stacked along the walls, and boxes were in the corners. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but then he noticed that one of the boxes near the back wall had been moved. It was tilted, not lined up with the others, and there were scuff marks on the floor, like it had been dragged across the tiles. His stomach sank. He knew he had closed that door earlier, and he knew he had not moved that box. He told himself it was probably nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him because he was tired. He pulled the door closed and went back to mopping, but his mind kept wandering to that room. He kept thinking he should check the windows. Maybe a student had snuck in somehow, but all the windows were locked from the inside. He tried to shake the feeling of being watched and focused on the cleaning. After finishing that hallway, he went down to the stairwell to head to the 2nd floor. As he walked past that same classroom again, his heart nearly stopped. The door was wide open. His breath caught in his throat. He knew he had shut it before. He slowly stepped closer. He peeked inside and the room looked normal, except the box was now moved to the center of the floor. His pulse was racing. He whispered, "Hello, who is in here?" His voice sounded tiny in the emptiness of the building. He waited, but there was silence. And then from the back of the room he heard slow, deep breathing. Not a gust of wind or a pipe. It was someone trying to be quiet, but making sure he could hear it. He tried to convince himself it was a student hiding, playing a prank. But how would they have gotten in? He was the only one who was supposed to be there, and all the doors were locked. He slammed the door shut and ran down the hallway to the stairwell. His heart was hammering and sweat ran down his back. He stayed pressed against the stairwell door, listening. He debated calling his supervisor, even though he hated bothering him in the middle of the night. Finally, he did. When his supervisor picked up, our custodian told him what was happening, trying to keep his voice steady. The supervisor said he would be there in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like hours. He stayed as far away from that room as possible, peeking over his shoulder every few seconds. Finally, his supervisor arrived. They went back up together. The supervisor had a big flashlight and walked straight into the classroom. The box was still in the middle of the floor. They checked everywhere, the closets, under the tables, Behind the desks, there was nothing. He suggested the custodian was just tired or imagining things. The custodian did not argue, but he knew what he had heard. That slow, heavy breathing. He tried to finish the rest of his shift with his supervisor there, but he kept glazing at that classroom. The hallway felt colder and more oppressive than ever. Even sweeping and mopping did not distract him. Weeks later, when he worked with another custodian, he was told that years ago, a student had been caught hiding in that classroom overnight. They had snuck in to play a prank, but it scared the staff so much that they never used that room again. It made sense, but it did not explain the breathing he heard that night. There was no one else in the school. He finished the shift and left, but every time he thought about it, his stomach twisted. He started taking extra precautions, ensuring all doors were locked, and eventually he transferred out of the school. Our third story comes from a night custodian who worked at an old high school for 2 years. The worst part of the job was always the auditorium. It was massive with 3 levels of seating, a big stage, and long, heavy curtains that hung from the ceiling. During the day, it looked normal. But at night, when the building was empty, it felt like stepping into a completely different place. Even with the lights on, there were shadows in every corner that seemed darker than they should be. Sound carried strangely in there. If you dropped a broom, the echo would stretch and bounce, making it hard to tell exactly where the sound came from. Most nights, he saved the auditorium for last because he hated going in there. There was just something about it that always made his skin crawl. Near the end of winter one year, he had to clean it earlier than usual because there was going to be a play the next morning. He arrived around midnight, dragging his cart behind him. The side door creaked loudly as he opened it, and when it slammed shut behind him, the echo traveled across the empty room. He started by sweeping the aisles between the seats. The chairs were old metal, folding seats bolted to the floor in some rows, and in other rows they were loose. As he pushed the broom, he listened to the scraping sound echo off the walls and ceiling. After a few minutes, he thought he heard something else. It was faint at first, like a soft rustling from the stage. He froze, thinking maybe a prop had fallen over. But when he looked, the stage was empty. He shook his head and told himself it was nothing. He continued sweeping. A few minutes later, he heard it again. This time it was more distinct, the sound of slow footsteps across the stage. He stopped sweeping and looked toward the stage. He could see the stacked props in the corners. Nothing moved, but the sound was real. His breathing became shallow. He slowly climbed the steps onto the stage, shining the flashlight behind the curtains. There were ropes, pulleys, old chairs, and painted scenery stacked against the walls. Everything was covered in dust, and the beam of his light made it dance like it was moving. He could not shake the feeling that someone or something was nearby. He backed off the stage, telling himself it was just the building settling, maybe a mouse in the rafters, but the feeling did not go away. He continued sweeping down the aisles, trying to finish as fast as possible. His mind kept going back to the stage. The sound of those slow footsteps repeated in his head, even though he could not hear them anymore. He finished sweeping the lower level and started mopping. As he pushed the mop through the rows, he thought he saw a shadow move across the second tier of seats. He moved his flashlight toward the seats, but nothing was there. The whispering came again, much clearer this time. It sounded exactly like someone speaking his name almost directly behind him. He spun around so fast that the flashlight slipped in his hands. The stage was completely empty. Nothing. The props were still stacked in the same place, and the curtains did not move, but he knew he had not imagined the voice. He backed away slowly with his heart racing, and he moved toward the side door. He stopped at the edge of the stage and listened. He could hear soft footsteps on the upper levels moving slowly across the balcony. He told himself it was impossible. The auditorium was locked. No one else should have been there. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting as if someone were pacing and watching him. He finally ran to the door, grabbed the handle, and pulled it open. The cold night air hit me like a wall, and he felt relief, but he could still hear the faint echo of footsteps above, fading away slowly. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely lock the heavy door behind him. He leaned against the cold metal, catching his breath and feeling the sweat running down his forehead. He did not go back inside that night. Weeks later, he learned that years ago, A drama teacher had died suddenly in that auditorium during a rehearsal. He had a sudden heart attack right on stage in front of his students. People said sometimes you could still hear him walking the stage at night or hear whispers in the seats. He tried to convince himself it was just a story, but he knew what he felt. He quit that job not long after, and he never looked back. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. There is a unique kind of quiet that comes with a heavy snowfall. In my small suburban neighborhood in southern Quebec, that quiet usually feels very peaceful. But for me, that silence is always there. I have a hearing disability that has made me hard of hearing for most of my life. I have learned to navigate the world a little differently because of it, relying heavily on my other senses. Still, I look back on what happened to me about a year ago, and I constantly wonder what could have happened, and what I should have done differently. It was right after the holiday season, and I was finally settling back down from traveling and all the get-togethers with family and friends. My quiet neighborhood borders a thick forest, and since most of the residents know each other, it has a warm, safe atmosphere. During the winter, I love to take my dog Monty for walks in those local woods. He is a Rottweiler Husky mix, which is perfect for me since I enjoy going for runs from time to time. The forest has several trails, none of which are challenging. On this specific afternoon in February, I had just finished having a late lunch and decided to take Monty out. As usual, Monty went absolutely ballistic when we turned the corner of my street towards the forest entrance. It was relatively cold, and a fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, creating a blank canvas. There were already a few yellow patches and boot prints near the entrance, signaling that some neighbors had taken their dogs out earlier. Most people like to walk before noon because the winter sun sets around 4 in the afternoon, so I did not expect to see anyone else out at that time. After walking for around 30 minutes, we came to a fork in the path. I noticed that one of the paths had not been walked yet, so feeling adventurous, I decided to take it. I had a solid memory of the trails, so I knew exactly where I was going. The trail led to a clearing, which was great since I wanted to check out the native birds with the binoculars I had gotten for Christmas. I remember scanning the tree line in the distance until I saw a strange shape. When I focused my binoculars, I saw a blue tarp and what looked to be a makeshift shelter. As curious as I was, it was getting dark, so I turned around and started walking back. Monty ran up ahead, but something seemed off in his behavior. He was much more alert and was sniffing the trail more than he normally would. When I looked down, my eyes widened. There was a set of footprints in the snow, much larger than my own. I turned my boots over out of sheer confusion to compare them. The prints were different, which left me with even more questions. There were no other forks in the trail, so whoever took it had to have passed me at some point. I figured they must have passed me while I was using my binoculars. At the time, it seemed like the most logical explanation, so I tried not to overthink it. At this point, it was significantly darker outside, but I could still make out my surroundings. As we were walking back, Monty stopped abruptly and started barking relentlessly in my direction. As I turned around, that is when I saw him. There was a man probably around 6 feet 4 inches tall, wearing charcoal-colored snow pants and a white camo jacket, standing only about a meter away from me. He did not make any movements towards me. He just stood there with his hands in his coat pockets. I did not recognize him, so I assumed he must have been a hiker from out of town. He looked like he was muttering something to me, but I could not read his lips due to the lack of lighting and my hearing disability. I also did not know if he was speaking English or French, which are both common in Quebec. I felt like an idiot for not bringing my phone with me, so I ended up trying to gesture to him that I was hard of hearing and that it was getting late. I got back home around 4:30, and by then, it was completely dark out. I followed my standard night routine, not really thinking much about the encounter, but in the middle of the night, something happened that still shakes me to this day. I woke up suddenly to Monty licking my hand. I checked my phone, and to my surprise, it was 3 in the morning. I noticed a text message from my neighbor asking if everything was all right. The message was a few minutes old and said Monty had been barking like he was possessed. I looked up to find that Monty was no longer in my room. I walked downstairs to find him barking hysterically at the glass patio door. As I approached, my vision was still blurry. I tried to focus my eyes when the backyard motion sensor light suddenly turned on. At that moment, my heart sank. The man from the forest was standing right there in my backyard. I stepped away from the door and texted 911 as fast as I could. I ran up to my room with Monty and grabbed the machete from under my bed. I am a shorter woman, and although I have a background in martial arts, I know very well that the best move in a fight is to not fight at all. I sat there in my room guarding Monty and myself, waiting for the police. With my heart beating out of my chest, I sat opposite the door with Monty by my side. It did not last long before Monty sprang up and began barking violently at the bedroom door. My hands were sweating profusely as I watched a shadow cast from underneath the door. The movement suggested the man was seconds from breaking in. Those had to be the longest minutes of my life. Luckily for me, the door never opened. When the police arrived, they searched the property and found the glass on the patio door had been completely smashed. The gate in my backyard was open, leading to the forest, which is where they believe the man disappeared to. I let them know about the shelter, and then stayed with a family friend for a few days. Ever since that day, I decided to stick to the main roads when walking Monty, trying not to think about what might have happened. If you think that forest encounter was terrifying, what happened to two young sisters in Illinois will make you lock your doors twice tonight. My name is Ember, and I am 16 years old. I live with my younger sister Kate, who is 15, and our parents. Our dad works for a deforestation group about 30 minutes from our house. It was a completely normal morning on December 5th, as my sister and I were getting ready to go out to the movies. We decided to go watch a somewhat new horror movie, Terrifier 3, which had some Christmas elements included in it. We knew the movie was rated 18+, but nobody paid much attention to our age, since we both looked older than we actually were anyway. We made our way to the theater and easily got in thanks to our appearance. However, halfway through the film, as everyone was eagerly anticipating the next scene, my phone suddenly buzzed loudly enough for the whole theater to hear. It completely ruined the vibe of the movie, and I could feel everyone turning toward me with highly annoyed looks on their faces. Embarrassed, my sister and I quickly scurried out of the row, and in my rush, I actually ended up tripping, which was incredibly embarrassing. Once we made it out of the theater lobby, I checked my phone to see who had been calling me. It was my dad. Instead of calling him back, I immediately received a text message from his number. The message said something like, "Hey, would you mind bringing me some lunch since the small cafe in the woods is shut today?" I looked over at Kate, and she looked back at me, a little confused, but neither of us second-guessed the message, since it seemed like a perfectly normal request. We arrived back home, packed up some food for him, and took my car down to the woods where he was working. I had always loved those woods and never felt uneasy there because the area was large, peaceful, and beautifully secluded. The scenery was amazing, featuring a steep hill that led down to a quiet lake that was perfect for fishing and photos. After a while, Kate and I got out of the car and began walking down the snowy path through the woods. I took out my phone to call my dad to let him know we were there, but he did not pick up. Confused, I looked over at Kate, who was just as puzzled as I was. Why would he not respond to our call when he had just texted us while we were at the movies? I decided to text him instead, reminding him that we were currently in the woods to deliver his lunch. After a few moments, I saw the 3 little dots appear on my screen, showing that he was typing. He responded by telling us to walk down the small hill and wait for him at the lake, which we immediately did. The sun was slowly setting since it was winter, meaning the sunset came much earlier than usual. The sky had a beautiful radiant orange glow over the hills. Snapping out of my thoughts, Kate suddenly pointed down to the lake where a man dressed in black was sitting on the wooden deck by the water with his back turned to us. We both assumed it was our dad. We walked down a bit more and stopped a little behind him. I called out his name, but he did not move or react. Kate suddenly grew very uneasy, and her anxious attitude made the entire scene feel extremely eerie. Slowly, I reached out and pulled off the hood he was wearing, which revealed a man who was definitely not our dad. Kate and I shrieked in terror as he turned around and began waving my dad's phone around like a maniac, smiling wildly as if he was happy to see us so scared. I blurted out, asking him why he was using our dad's phone, but he did not respond at all. Instead, he suddenly lunged forward and grabbed Kate's arm as she screamed in terror. Luckily, I was strong enough to pull her away from his grip, and we both started running back up the hill as fast as we possibly could. The adrenaline pushed through us so much that I had never seen either of us run that fast before. Behind me, I could hear heavy stomping footsteps getting closer, so I knew we were actively being chased. I did not dare to turn around. Finally, we reached the safety of my car. I slammed the door shut and locked it just as the man came up to my window, and then he suddenly crouched down out of sight. Terrified, I put the car in reverse and sped away back home. When we arrived home, my dad and mom were both sitting there in the living room. We arrived panting, completely out of breath, and frantically explained the whole situation to them. My dad was absolutely furious and explained that his phone had been stolen out of his truck while he was working, which was why he had decided to come back home early. He realized the man must have taken his phone and messaged us. My dad immediately called the police and filed a report. They used the tracking number to locate the device, which was still sitting on the wooden deck by the lake, and they eventually returned the phone to my dad. They told us there was not much else they could do since the phone had already been found, and the suspect was gone. I honestly thought this was the absolute end of it, but I would not be telling this story if it was. 6 hours later, around 1 in the morning, I got a text from an unknown number. The message said, "I like that your house is lit only by your bedroom television." I immediately went completely cold and pale. I paused the television and heard a distinct rustling sound directly outside my window. My room was on the second floor. I shut my phone and listened closely. Slowly, I peeked through the blinds and saw the man standing there, smiling, with a gun pointed directly at my window. I screamed and pulled away, just as the glass shattered everywhere across my room. My parents ran in, followed closely by Kate. I screamed for them to crouch down and told them the man was outside with a gun. When my dad went to check, the man was already gone. Then we suddenly heard another loud bang and more glass breaking downstairs in the kitchen. We ran and locked ourselves in my parents' bedroom as Kate called 911. My mom hugged us as we cried in absolute fear. Throughout the whole situation, I kept wondering how he had managed to find out exactly where we lived. A few moments later, the police arrived and searched the entire house, but nobody was there. Kate and I explained the situation again, and one of the officers suggested they check my car. Surprisingly, a small electronic tracking tag was found placed deep inside my tire well, which perfectly explained how the man knew where we lived and why he had crouched down before I sped out of the woods. The police told us they would patrol the streets and do everything they could to find him. A few months later, he still had not been found, but he never returned. My family is still traumatized, and I feel stupid for not being alarmed when he only responded through texts, but I will definitely be more careful from now on. Our final story takes us back to the freezing winter of 2021, during the height of the pandemic. One word to describe my day back then was hectic. Work was a complete disaster. Since it was prime pandemic times, I was working entirely from home, which meant my schedule was always all over the place. I was supposed to be meeting with my extended family upstate for the holidays, but I ended up getting stuck on a nearly 3-hour Zoom meeting for work. By the time I finally managed to log off, it was a whole hour and a half after everyone else had already arrived at my parents' house. And that did not even include the next 2 hours or so that the long trek up to their place would take me in my car. Before leaving, I filled up 2 large cups of coffee in my kitchen to take with me. I knew I would need every single drop of caffeine to make it through the drive. The second I opened my front door, however, I realized this drive was going to be much more of a disaster than I had originally anticipated. The snow and wind had already picked up significantly since earlier that evening, and the streets were barely even plowed. The ground had at least 2 feet of snow already, and the weather forecast said it was supposed to keep snowing like this for a majority of the night. Because of the terrible conditions, I was forced to drive under 25 miles per hour on most of the residential roads. My car at the time was a really old, crappy Hyundai, which was not ideal for extreme weather conditions at all. It did not have anti-lock brakes either, making every stop a guessing game. I am usually a pretty fast driver though, so when I finally managed to get on the highway, I raised my speed to 70 miles per hour. It was probably a lot faster than was safe for the current road conditions, but I was desperate to get to my destination. I finally arrived at my parents' house around 9 o'clock. They had already begun dinner without me, but thankfully they were not too far along, so I was able to join in. After a few drinks and sharing some holiday gifts, I started to completely lose track of time. I got so caught up in seeing all of my relatives, whom I had not spoken to in a while, that I ended up basically forgetting that I still had a long drive home ahead of me, even as most of my family members had started to say their goodbyes and leave. Once I finally got back into my car to head home, it was past midnight, and at least another foot of fresh snow had accumulated on the ground. I was a bit buzzed from the drinks, but I figured I was sober enough to drive home. I do not condone drinking and driving at all, but I was tired and simply wanted to get back to my own bed. As I was heading back towards the highway, I realized the local roads were completely dead. Not a single other vehicle was in sight. I made the grave mistake of raising my speed to 40 miles per hour down one particular stretch of road. As I began to approach a sharp bend, I suddenly realized my car had gone into a dangerous skid. I tried not to panic, as this was not the first time I had skidded on ice. I started to steer into the direction of the skid and downshifted the gears to slow down. But as I got even closer to the curve and my car still was not slowing down, absolute panic set in. My car went straight off the side of the road, crashed into a large tree, and the airbag deployed. I was momentarily in total shock from the force of the impact. But thankfully, I was relatively unscathed other than a few minor bumps. My car, on the other hand, was completely ruined. The entire front hood was buried deep in a massive bank of snow surrounding the tree I had hit. There was absolutely no chance of me pushing it back onto the road by myself. The very first thing I did was call my roadside assistance company, and they told me they would send a tow truck to my location. But because of the horrible weather conditions, they warned me it could take up to 40 minutes for the truck to reach me. I was stranded on a completely deserted road, surrounded by thick forest with no houses for miles in either direction. I decided to call my parents and ask one of them to drive over and wait with me in the cold. My dad said he would get in his car and drive over right away. I hung up the phone and waited in the quiet car. As I was sitting there, I began to hear something over the sound of the wind howling outside. There were undeniably footsteps crunching in the deep snow. I could not tell exactly from where they were coming, but they sounded somewhat distant. I opened the driver's side door and stepped out, looking over the roof of my car into the dark. I was not hearing the footsteps anymore. Instead, I was hearing some new strange sounds. It was hard to describe, but it sounded like a wet, heavy slurping. I looked over to where I thought the sound was coming from, and I could see some slight movement by the tree line. It was dark as hell, but I was pretty certain I was looking at the silhouette of a person standing there. I called out a loud hello, but the slurping sound stopped immediately and no one answered. I sat there for a few more seconds awkwardly, but no one ever responded or appeared. I was officially freaked out, so I got back inside my car and locked the doors. Less than a minute later, I heard footsteps in the snow again. Then I suddenly heard a loud thud hit the passenger side window. I could not see out of it because it was covered in snow. Once again, I opened the driver's side door and stepped out. Checking my surroundings, I made a disturbing discovery. There were fresh boot prints circling all around my car, leading into the dark woods. I also noticed there were dark drops of fresh blood in the snow. I grabbed my 9mm handgun from the glove compartment and began to follow the footprints into the woods. A few yards in, my flashlight revealed a dead, decapitated deer with its stomach ripped completely open. This was getting too weird, so I quickly headed back to my car. I opened the driver's side door, and I had to keep myself from vomiting. Lying directly in my driver's seat was the severed head of the deer, staring right at me. I booked it out of there, running down the dark road until headlights appeared. It was my dad. I got in and explained everything, but he did not believe me. We drove back together to inspect the scene. The footprints were still there, but the deer head was completely gone. All that remained was a large dark pool of blood on my seat and drag marks in the snow. I chose not to call the police. I have no idea who was in the woods that night. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, We have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We often think of our lives as being divided into safe zones. There are the places we go where we feel absolutely secure, like our old schools, our friends' houses, and especially our own homes. We go about our daily routines thinking that nothing could ever pierce that bubble of safety. But the truth is, the world is much more unpredictable, and sometimes much darker than we like to admit. The places we trust the most can easily become the settings for our worst nightmares. Sometimes the threats are hidden right beneath our feet, waiting in the dark corners we choose to ignore. Other times they follow us from hundreds of miles away, driven by an obsession we did not even know existed. And in the worst cases, the danger climbs right through our windows, standing in the hallway of our homes while our families sleep. Think about it. When you walk into your local school, or when you gather in your backyard with your friends for a weekend party, or when you tuck your children into bed at night, you are operating on a fundamental assumption. You assume that the doors are locked, that the walls are solid, and that the people around you have good intentions. We have to believe this just to get through the day without being consumed by paranoia. But what happens when that assumption is completely shattered? What happens when you realize that the barrier between you and absolute terror is incredibly thin? The three stories we are looking at today are real accounts from people who had their sense of safety violently ripped away. They are stories of hidden dangers, obsessive stalking, and terrifying home invasions that will make you double-check your locks tonight. Let us start with a story from a small town back when high school was a completely different experience. When I was in high school, I was what you would call a nerd. Back then, it was not a term of endearment like it can be today. I hear people all the time now wear that word like a badge of honor. For my friends and me, it was like getting hit in the stomach repeatedly. High school was just different then. We would get beaten up for not liking the same music or not being into sports. It seems cliche, but it is the absolute truth. Junior year was the worst year for all the bullying. This kid Steve tormented us all year. He was bigger than us, louder than us, and he made it his personal mission to make our lives miserable. He would trip us in the cafeteria, knock our books out of our hands in the hallway, and laugh with his friends while we scrambled to pick them up off the dirty floor. Towards the end of the school year, Steve thought it would be a good idea to break into the school to play one of his stupid pranks, just because he wanted to prove to everyone how cool he was. Well, Steve was so cool that he ended up getting caught. But before I continue with what happened to him, I should lay a little bit of groundwork first. My school is now closed, but back then it was one of the more popular private schools in this area. We had to wear strict uniforms and go to regular church services during school hours. The school building itself was incredibly old. Before being converted into a school back in the 1950s, it was some sort of hospital for the sick. I remember hearing that when they built the school in the 50s and tore up some of the ground, they found a ton of skeletal remains from people who had passed away from tuberculosis, among other things. Because people did not want to get sick from the bodies, they would just dispose of them in this underground tunnel that used to connect the hospital with another building. These stories, whether they were true or not, became the stuff of legend around my hometown, especially for students of the school. In other words, they were almost passed down like urban legends from one graduating class to the next. The seniors would tell the freshmen about the tunnels, describing how the walls were still stained, and how the spirits of the dead still wandered the hallways at night. The school, being so old and looking old, I might add, was just an objectively scary place sometimes. Rumors started to swirl around that the school was haunted, like souls not resting properly, and all that fun stuff. You would constantly hear strange noises all the time with no explanation. Creaking floorboards, heavy thuds, and pipes whistling through the walls. It was just your typical school spirit response to say, yes, those noises must just be the ghosts. However, the more logical answer is that the school just made a lot of noise because the building was old and falling apart. But back to Steve. The reason why Steve wanted to break in was that he wanted to pull this highly elaborate prank. He successfully broke in over the weekend, climbing through a window that had been left unlatched in the back. Once inside, he started ripping classrooms apart, throwing papers everywhere, tipping over teachers' desks, and even went to the library and pulled tons of books off the shelves, leaving them scattered in piles on the floor. You are probably wondering how Steve got caught. Well, to cap off his ghostly prank, he went to the art room, stole red paint, and started writing a message across the lockers. Your typical horror movie tropes. He wrote things like, "Get out, your soul is next," and my personal favorite, "Death is coming." While he was writing on these lockers, Steve claimed that he heard something coming from the basement. According to Steve, he went to the basement door, and before going downstairs, he saw shadows moving and heard voices talking from the darkness below. He said it sounded evil and not just like normal whispers. It scared him so badly that he dropped his paintbrush, ran out of the school, and left his paint cans behind. It did not take long for the administration to match his handwriting with that of the red paint on the lockers. My school had enough of Steve's nonsense, and they expelled him that week following the investigation. I will never forget Steve screaming as he was leaving the principal's office, screaming about something evil in the basement. His words, not mine. He was crying, his face red, pointing his finger toward the floor, yelling that there was something alive down there. I was confident that Steve was making it up, doing anything he could to save himself from getting in trouble. Everyone was so sad about Steve, except for my few friends and myself, who absolutely hated the kid. In our opinion, he got exactly what he deserved. For the last few weeks of school, we had to listen to everyone talk about how brave he was and how he could have died. Yeah, I am not even kidding. These fools really thought that Steve was in danger from evil spirits. As school was wrapping up for the year, I suggested something crazy to my friends. On the last day of school, we should break into the school and do what Steve could not. We could prove that there are no evil spirits, no ghosts, and most importantly, that Steve was a lying punk. My friends agreed. The plan was just to break in quietly, make our way to the basement, prove that it is just a basement, and then leave. If we heard anything, we run. We do not get caught, as Steve did. We thought that if we ran and did not get caught, nobody would suspect us, because we were the nerds, the teacher's pets, the fools that actually liked to learn. We were not the type of kids to do something like this, especially after someone got caught. I remember the night vividly. It was cold for an early summer night. We all had sweatpants and jackets on. We really embraced the whole criminal breaking in identity. We had our hoods up and tried our best to be sneaky. Breaking in was not exactly hard for us. Not because we are these master criminals, but because my friend Carson's mom was a janitor for the school and had access to a key. Half the reason we decided to do this. Carson swiped the key from her kitchen counter, where she kept her work items, and we just walked through the back door of the school. I will admit it was objectively unsettling in there. Anyone who has been in their school after dark knows the feeling of being somewhere you are not supposed to be. I do not know if we are hardwired that way, but there is just something about being in the school after dark that is unnerving for us. Maybe it was just the years of hearing about all the ghosts. I sort of figured I was subconsciously fearing evil ghosts. Urban legends are a powerful thing. We eventually got to the basement door, and I have to admit I was feeling something. I do not know about my friends, but I was actually kind of scared. I did not tell them that, because I did not want them to make fun of me. My logic in that moment was that I was here, and I am going through with this. We opened the heavy wooden door to the basement, and the first thing that hit us was the absolute darkness. It was not just dark, it was the kind of heavy, thick blackness that felt like it was pressing against your chest. A cool, damp draft of air blew up from the stairs, bringing with it the smell of old concrete, dust, and something else that I could not quite identify, something sweet and metallic. It was a dark staircase that led to an even darker basement. Carson led the way, taking the first step down, and the wooden stair groaned loudly under his weight. We froze, holding our breath, waiting to see if anyone had heard us, but there was only silence. We followed him down, one by one. Cell phones were not exactly popular yet, and they most definitely did not have flashlights on them yet, so we were using straight-up dollar store flashlights. These were the cheap yellow plastic ones that you had to shake occasionally just to keep the weak bulb from flickering out. As we made our way downstairs, the basement was creepy, obviously. It was a massive, cavernous space that felt more like a dungeon than a school basement. It was an old building with a dusty basement, and the walls were made of rough, unfinished stone. There were boxes of storage everywhere, stacked high like a maze. We looked through a few as we walked through the basement, our flashlight beams darting across the cardboard boxes. It was old textbooks with faded covers, dusty Christmas decorations, and extra school uniforms that had probably been sitting there for decades. Probably the creepiest thing about the basement for me was all the old religious statues. Our school was private, and they had stored all these old, chipped plaster statues of saints and religious figures down here. I am weird, but for some reason old religious statues scare me. They are just unsettling to me, with their unblinking glass eyes and pale, painted faces that look like they are watching you in the dark. It is the same reason why old churches freak me out. We continued exploring the basement for a few more minutes, our footsteps echoing softly on the cold concrete floor. We did not find any people, but we did find out how massively huge the basement was. It felt like it extended forever into the darkness under the school. Our flashlights were not even powerful enough to see the end of the basement from where we were standing. I know they were cheap flashlights, but still, the absolute vastness of the space was terrifying. Eventually, we made our way to one of the furthest corners of the basement. It felt colder for some reason, a deep chill that seemed to seep right through our jackets. We moved some of the heavy cardboard boxes of old textbooks out of the way, and we could not believe our eyes. There was a small hole in the stone wall, near the floor. I would say probably the size of a large beach ball. It was small, but large enough for a person to crawl through if they squeezed. Carson wanted to check it out, but my other friend and I were completely against it. It felt wrong, and the air coming out of that hole smelled incredibly bad. Instead of crawling in, we shone the flashlight through the hole. It was just dark inside. It looked like a tunnel, constructed of old, damp brick. We all had the same idea at that exact moment. This was probably the remains of the old underground tunnel, where they had stored all the bodies of the tuberculosis victims back in the day. It was a Friday night in late September, and the air was just starting to get that sharp, biting cold that tells you winter is on its way. I was 15 years old at the time, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood where nothing ever really happened. On this particular night, my parents had planned a dinner out with some old family friends. Before they left, they made sure to let me know they would not be returning until very late, which was music to my ears. To a 15-year-old, having the entire house to yourself for a whole evening feels like absolute freedom. As soon as their car pulled out of the driveway, I decided to invite over my neighbor and best friend, Chris. He lived right across the street, so it only took him about 30 seconds to run over to my front door. Chris was the same age as me, and we had been inseparable for years. Usually when he came over, we would just head straight down to my basement to play video games or watch movies. But for some reason, on this cold September night, we got bored incredibly fast. We had been sitting in the basement for about an hour, staring at a screen, when the energy in the room just died. We went upstairs to the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, stared at the empty shelves, and closed it again. That was when Chris brought up a completely random idea. He suggested we play a game of hide and seek. At first I laughed. It sounded incredibly dumb. We were teenagers, not toddlers. But then I remembered that we had actually played it a few months prior with a larger group of friends, and it had actually been a lot of fun. Plus, my house, while relatively small, was packed with odd corners and deep shadows, especially once you turned off the lights. To make things a bit more interesting and a lot scarier, we decided to turn off almost every single light in the house. The only light we kept on was a dim bulb in the kitchen, which cast a faint, eerie glow down the main hallway. We agreed on some very simple but strict rules. There was to be absolutely no going outside into the cold, and we were strictly forbidden from going up into the dusty attic or the tight crawl space under the porch. The basement, the bedrooms, the closets, and anywhere under the furniture were all considered fair game. Chris was excited and immediately volunteered to hide first. I agreed, stood in the center of the dark living room, covered my eyes with my hands, and began to count slowly to 50. In the quiet of the house, I could hear the faint, rapid thud of his sneakers as he ran down the hall, followed by a brief rustle of some coats, and then complete heavy silence. I finished my count, shouted out that I was coming to find him, and began my search. I started in the kitchen since it was right next to the living room. but there was nowhere good to hide in there besides the pantry, which was empty. I checked behind the basement door, then slowly made my way down the long hallway. I pushed open the bathroom door, but it was empty. I checked the coat closet near the front entrance, pulling back the heavy winter jackets, but found nothing. Then I decided to head upstairs. The old wooden stairs creaked loudly under my weight, and in the pitch blackness of the house, every single little sound made my muscles tense up. I checked my parents' bedroom first. I bent down, lifting the heavy comforter to peer under the bed, and then checked behind the tall wooden dresser. But there was nobody there. I walked back down the hallway and entered my own bedroom. It was incredibly messy, with clothes scattered everywhere, but there really wasn't a spot big enough for Chris to squeeze into. Still, to be thorough, I checked my closet and crawled under my desk. Nothing. That left only one room upstairs, the guest room at the very end of the hall. As I approached, I noticed the door was cracked open just a tiny bit. I slowly pushed it open, fully expecting Chris to jump out from behind it and scream to scare me. But when the door swung wide, the room was completely dark and utterly silent. The window was slightly rattled by the autumn wind outside, creating a low whistling sound. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the shadows, and scanned the space. I knelt down on the carpet and peered under the guest bed, but there was nothing but dust. I opened the closet door, but it was completely empty. At this point, I figured he must have gone down to the basement, so I turned around and headed back downstairs. I walked through the dark basement, checking behind the loud laundry machines and squeezing into the cramped storage space underneath the wooden stairs. I was just about to give up and call out for him when I finally spotted him. He was curled up in a tight ball behind some old cardboard boxes in the far corner of the basement. He started laughing as I found him, asking me how long it had taken me to track him down. I told him it had taken way too long, and then we prepared to switch. And then it was my turn to hide, and his turn to count. I ran upstairs while I heard him begin his count in the basement. I decided to head straight for the guest room at the end of the hall. I quickly and quietly slid myself under the guest bed, pulling the fabric bed skirt down so that it completely covered me and blocked out any view of the room. I lay there on my stomach in the absolute darkness, my chest rising and falling rapidly as my heart raced with excitement. A few minutes later, I heard the heavy basement door creak open downstairs, followed by the slow, heavy thud of Chris's footsteps climbing the stairs. He was taking his time, trying to be quiet. I heard him open the bathroom door first, then I heard his footsteps move into my parents' bedroom. After a few moments, the slow footsteps began to travel down the hallway toward the guest room where I was hiding. I held my breath, trying to be as silent as a statue. I could hear the sound of someone breathing as they walked slowly into the guest room. The footsteps stopped right next to the side of the bed. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. I could hear the rubber soles of his shoes shuffling softly against the carpet. And then there was a long, agonizing silence. I was convinced he had figured out exactly where I was and was just waiting to yank up the bed skirt to terrify me. But instead of doing that, the footsteps slowly turned around and walked back out of the room. I lay there in the dark for a few more minutes, waiting to hear him call out from downstairs that he had given up and that I had won the round. But the house remained completely and utterly silent. Eventually, my back started to ache, so I crawled out from under the bed. I walked downstairs, fully expecting to find Chris sitting on the couch in the living room, but the couch was empty. I called out into the darkness, telling him that the game was over and that he could come out now. A faint voice echoed from the very bottom of the basement stairs, telling me that he was still down there. I shook my head, thinking he was just trying to mess with my head. I walked over to the basement door, pushed open the wooden door, and shouted down into the dark stairwell. Chris shouted back from the darkness below, telling me that he was still actively searching for me, and he asked me where on earth I had been hiding. That single question made my stomach violently twist. I told him, with a sudden chill running down my spine, that I was already out of my hiding spot and standing in the kitchen. A second later, I heard the rapid sound of his sneakers running up the wooden stairs. He stepped into the dim light of the kitchen and looked completely baffled. He asked me how I had managed to get upstairs so incredibly fast. I looked at him, confused, and told him that I hadn't run past him at all, because I had been hiding under the guest bed upstairs the entire time. Chris frowned, his expression turning serious. He said he could have sworn on his life that he had just checked that exact guest room, and while he was standing in there, he heard someone slowly moving around and breathing in the darkness. I stared at him, my heart dropping, and told him that I had stayed perfectly still and hadn't made a single sound. We stood there arguing in the kitchen for a couple of minutes, both of us trying to convince the other that they were just playing a trick. But eventually, we just shrugged it off, attributing it to our overactive imaginations in the dark house. We decided to play one more round, but the comfortable, fun atmosphere of the night was completely gone. I felt incredibly uneasy. Every single creak of the old house made me jump. At one point, while I was standing in the living room counting, I thought I heard a soft, muffled thud coming from the second floor. But when I went up to search, the rooms were completely empty, and I eventually found Chris hiding in the laundry room. We decided we had had enough of the game, so we sat down on the living room couch and turned the television back on, trying to shake off the weird vibe. That was when both of us completely froze. From directly upstairs, we heard an incredibly loud bump, like something very heavy had just fallen onto the floorboards. Chris looked at me, his eyes wide with fear, and whispered, asking if my parents had just come home. I looked at him and reminded him that their dinner plans meant they wouldn't be back for hours, and there was no car in the driveway. The hair on my arms stood completely on end. We sat there in absolute silence, straining our ears. Chris suggested that maybe something had just slid off a shelf in one of the closets, and I desperately wanted to believe him. But as we sat there listening, we both heard it clearly. It was the slow, unmistakable creak of floorboards upstairs. It was the distinct sound of someone slowly walking down the hallway. We stared at each other, paralyzed with fear. I whispered that we should go up and check. Chris immediately shook his head, telling me there was no way we should do that. But my mind was racing. If someone had actually broken into my house, we couldn't just sit there on the couch waiting for them to come down. I told Chris to stay right behind me, and I reached over to grab the heavy metal fireplace poker from the stand next to the hearth. We crept toward the stairs and began to climb them, one excruciating step at a time. The house was so quiet that the only sound was the sound of my own shallow breathing and the soft groans of the wooden steps under our feet. When we finally reached the top landing, I pointed the metal poker toward the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was now completely closed. I knew for an absolute fact that I had left it cracked open when we came downstairs. We stood there, frozen on the landing. Then, from directly behind that closed door, came a slow dragging sound, like heavy fabric sliding across the carpet. Chris whispered in a panicked voice that we needed to get out of the house right now. I wanted to run, but a mix of sheer terror and adrenaline kept my feet glued to the floor. I raised the heavy fireplace poker, took a deep breath, and reached out to grab the brass doorknob. My hand was shaking so violently that the metal poker clattered slightly in my grip. I gripped the knob, turned it, and pushed the door open as fast as I could. The room was dark, but the faint light from the hallway showed the bed and the dresser. Nobody was there. However, the closet door, which had been shut, was now standing halfway open. I slowly moved closer to the closet while Chris stayed frozen in the hallway. I reached out and yanked the closet door completely open. Inside, there was nothing but winter coats and cardboard boxes. We both let out incredibly shaky, nervous laughs, trying to convince ourselves that we had just let our minds run wild. But just as we turned around to walk back down the stairs, we heard another sound. This time, it did not come from upstairs. It came from directly below us on the first floor. It was the distinct, heavy sound of the front door clicking open and then swinging shut. We froze in place. Chris whispered that someone was officially inside the house with us. I felt my stomach drop into a bottomless pit of terror. We ran as fast and as quietly as we could down the hall and ducked into my dark bedroom, closing the door behind us. I held the fireplace poker tight against my chest, my knuckles turning white. We listened intently. At first, there was nothing but dead silence. But then we heard faint, slow footsteps walking across the hardwood floor of the living room. I wanted desperately to call the police, but my cell phone was sitting on the couch downstairs where we had left it. I whispered to Chris that we should try to climb out my bedroom window, but the window was far too small for either of us to squeeze through. The only way out of the house was down the long hallway, past the stairs. The footsteps downstairs started moving closer to the center of the house. We heard the heavy basement door swing open. Then, we heard the distinct sound of footsteps going down the basement stairs, one slow step at a time. We both let out a quiet exhale of relief. Whoever was in the house had just gone down into the basement, which gave us a tiny window of opportunity. We didn't waste a single second. We slipped out of my bedroom, sprinted down the hallway, flew down the stairs, ran through the dark kitchen, and burst out of the back door into the cold night air. We ran across the yard, climbed over the fence, and didn't stop running until we reached Chris's house across the street. His parents were home, sitting in their living room, and when they saw our pale, terrified faces and heard our frantic story, they immediately called the police. Within 10 minutes, several police officers arrived at my house. They searched every single square inch of the property, from the attic down to the dark corners of the basement. They even checked the crawl space under the porch that we were forbidden from entering, but when they finished, they came back to us with frustrating news. They found absolutely nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no open windows, and no one hiding in the basement. The officers tried to reassure us, saying it was likely just the old house settling in the cold air, or that our imaginations had simply run wild while playing a scary game in the dark. But Chris and I both knew exactly what we had heard. We knew without a shadow of a doubt that someone had been inside that house with us. For weeks after that night, I couldn't sleep. Every tiny creak of the floorboards made me sit bolt upright in bed, convinced that someone was standing just outside my door. That was the last time I ever played hide and seek in my life. Chris and I never really talked about that night again, but even now, years later, when we look at each other, I can tell we are both remembering the exact same thing. We are remembering the sound of that closet door, the dragging noise on the carpet, and the heavy footsteps downstairs. We never found out who it was. Maybe it was a burglar who realized kids were home and decided to hide. Or maybe it was someone who slipped out the front door the moment we ran out the back. All I know is that playing hide and seek that night showed us just how terrifying it is to realize you are not alone in your own home. And so, that was the first time I realized that games like these could be a gateway to something far more dangerous. But the problem was, that wasn't the only time a simple game of hide and seek turned into a real-life nightmare. Years later, I moved to a different town, but the stories of childhood games colliding with terrifying reality seemed to follow me. I grew up in a neighborhood that backed right up against a massive, dense stretch of woods. The houses on our street were lined up on one side, and directly behind them was nothing but thick, towering trees that went on for miles. When I was younger, a group of us neighborhood kids used to hang out almost every single weekend. During the hot summer months, we would stay outside late into the night, ignoring the passage of time until our parents finally started yelling from the back porches for us to come inside. One of our absolute favorite games to play in the evenings was hide and seek. We would usually start out playing in our backyards, but as the night went on, we would inevitably push the boundaries and venture into the very edge of the dark woods. During the day, the woods were peaceful and familiar, but at night, the entire atmosphere shifted. The thick canopy of trees swallowed up the moonlight, and everything looked completely identical, no matter which direction you turned. That was what made it so incredibly scary, and honestly, that was what made it so much fun for a group of kids. The last time I ever played hide and seek in those woods was when I was 14 years old. It was a suffocatingly hot and humid night in August. The air was thick, and the constant deafening hum of cicadas filled our ears. There were 5 of us playing that night. Myself, my close friend Tyler, his younger brother Matt, and 2 other kids who lived down the street, Jason and Eric. We had all decided to play outside because the night air, even though it was humid, felt much cooler than sitting inside a stuffy basement. We established a very simple rule for the game. We could hide anywhere we wanted in the backyards or inside the woods, but we had to stay close enough to the edge so that we could hear the seeker call out when the round was officially over. Jason volunteered to be the seeker first. The rest of us immediately scattered into the darkness. I ran straight into the woods alongside Tyler, but we split up the moment we passed the first thick row of pine trees. I found a large fallen log covered in moss, and I crouched down behind it, my heart beating rapidly in my chest, despite knowing it was just a harmless game. In the distance, back in the brightly lit yard, I could hear Jason shouting out his numbers. His voice echoed faintly through the dark trees, counting down to 50. When he finished, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the woods. The only sounds were the loud buzzing of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves in the warm breeze. I stayed low to the ground, keeping perfectly still. After about 5 minutes of waiting, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps snapping twigs and rustling through the dry leaves. The steps were coming from the path between the trees. Naturally, I assumed it was Jason searching for us. I held my breath, pressing my back against the damp log, waiting for him to walk past my hiding spot. But the footsteps stopped. Whoever it was, they were standing just a few feet away from where I was crouching. I waited for them to call out my name or take another step, but they just stood there in the pitch black. I felt a sudden, icy prickle of fear wash over my skin. The silence stretched on for so long that I almost opened my mouth to ask who was there. But then I remembered the rules of the game. If I spoke, I would immediately lose, so I forced myself to remain completely silent. Finally, the heavy steps started up again. They crunched slowly through the leaves, but instead of heading back toward the safety of the yards, they moved deeper and deeper into the dark, thick woods. I listened intently until the sound of the footsteps completely faded away. I cautiously peeked over the top of the fallen log, but the woods were far too dark to see anything. The faint moonlight only managed to illuminate the very tops of the trees. I stayed hidden for a few more minutes until I grew tired of waiting. I finally crawled out from behind the log and started slowly making my way back toward the edge of the woods. As I walked, I heard Jason's voice calling out from the backyard, announcing that the round was over and that everyone should come back in. I quickened my pace and stepped out into the yard, where I found Tyler, Eric, and Jason already standing under the porch light. Matt came running out of the trees a moment later, his clothes covered in dirt, laughing and boasting that nobody would have ever found him. I walked up to the group and mentioned that I had been hiding behind the fallen log, and that Jason had almost caught me when he walked right past my spot. Jason stopped laughing and looked at me with a genuinely confused expression. He told me that he had never gone that far into the woods. In fact, he said he had only circled around the very first row of trees near the fence before finding Tyler and Eric. I squinted my eyes, trying to understand what he was saying. I asked him who on earth had been walking past my log if it wasn't him. The other kids just shrugged their shoulders, dismissing it as a stray animal, or just the wind playing tricks on me. We brushed the weird moment off and decided to keep playing. For the next round, I was designated as the seeker. I stood against a large oak tree in the yard, closed my eyes, and counted loudly while the others ran off to hide. When I finished my count, I searched the backyard first, quickly finding Eric hiding behind the tool shed and Tyler crouching in some thick bushes near the house. With the two of them found, I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the dark woods to search for Jason and Matt. The woods were incredibly quiet, and the bright beam of my flashlight cut through the thick shadows. I walked slowly, stepping carefully over roots and listening for any sound of movement. After a few minutes of searching, the beam of my light caught Matt crouching behind a wide tree trunk. I yelled out that I had found him, and he jumped up, laughed, and ran back toward the safety of the yard. That left only Jason. I started walking deeper into the trees, calling out his name and warning him that I was closing in. That was when I heard it again. It was the exact same sound of slow, heavy footsteps moving in the dark, just a short distance ahead of me. I aimed my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the trees were incredibly thick, and the light just bounced off the dense leaves and trunks. I started walking slowly toward the noise, trying to be quiet. The footsteps suddenly stopped. I stood there, waiting in the dark. At this point, I was starting to get genuinely nervous. The woods felt incredibly cold all of a sudden, but then, to my immense relief, I heard Jason's voice calling out from far behind me, saying that the round was over and he was heading back. I spun around quickly, shining my flashlight toward the yard. I saw Jason already walking out of the tree line. I ran up to him, completely bewildered, and asked him if he had just been standing ahead of me in the deep woods. Jason looked at me like I was crazy. He said he had been hiding close to the edge of the yard the entire time and hadn't gone deep into the woods at all. I felt a cold knot of dread form in my stomach. Twice now, in the span of an hour, I had heard someone moving through the dark woods who was definitely not one of us. I tried to tell myself that it was just a deer or a wild animal, but deep down I knew the rhythm of those footsteps. They were too slow, too deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to a small animal. We played a few more rounds, but I couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. Every time I hid, my eyes were glued to the shadows. I kept hearing faint noises in the trees, branches snapping and leaves rustling. At one point, I even thought I saw a tall, dark shadow shift between two trees, but when I aimed my flashlight at the spot, there was nothing there. The other kids didn't seem to notice a thing. They were just laughing, running around, and enjoying the summer night. I tried my best to act completely normal, but the nervous pit in my stomach was growing larger by the minute. For the very last round of the night, Jason insisted on hiding deep in the woods again. We all split up just like we had done before. I really didn't want to go back into the deep dark, so I decided to stay near the very edge of the tree line, crouching down low in some tall grass. From my spot, I could see the warm, comforting glow of the porch lights through the leaves. I heard Jason's faint voice counting down from the yard. When he finished, the familiar silence settled over the woods once more. After a few minutes of lying in the grass, I heard a sound that completely froze the blood in my veins. It was a whisper. It was a low, raspy voice, speaking in a tone that was far too soft to make out the actual words, but it was incredibly close to where I was lying. My entire body tensed up. I slowly peeked over the tall grass, searching the dark gap between the trees, but the woods appeared completely empty. I listened as hard as I could, but the whispering had stopped. A second later, the sound of heavy footsteps started up again, moving slowly past my hiding spot and deeper into the dark forest. I lay there trembling in the dirt, terrified to move a single muscle. A moment later, Jason called out that the game was over. The other kids emerged from the trees, laughing and brushing dirt off their shirts. I slowly got to my feet and walked back to the yard, my heart hammering against my chest. I told them, in a shaky voice, that I had just heard someone whispering in the woods right next to me, but they all just laughed, accusing me of trying to make up a scary story to freak them out. I didn't bother arguing with them, but I knew exactly what I had heard. We sat in Tyler's backyard for a while after that, drinking sodas and talking about school. It was during a lull in the conversation that Matt, Tyler's younger brother, looked up and asked a question that made my heart stop. He asked if anyone else had noticed the man. The entire yard went dead silent. We all turned to look at him. Matt explained that while he was hiding behind a tree, he thought he saw a very tall man standing perfectly still in the deep woods. He said the man didn't move a single inch. He just stood there in the shadows, wearing dark clothing and watching us play. Jason immediately told him he was being ridiculous, and Eric laughed it off as a trick of the light. But I felt physically sick. I believed every single word Matt said, because it explained the heavy footsteps, the shadow I had seen, and the terrifying whisper in the grass. We ended the night right after that, and everyone went home. I lay in my bed that night, staring blankly at the ceiling, completely unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that low whisper echoing in my head, and the slow, heavy crunch of footsteps in the dry leaves. I never played hide-and-seek in those woods ever again. Even now, whenever I hear the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot in the dark, my mind immediately flashes back to that humid August night. I think about the tall man Matt saw standing in the dark, the footsteps that didn't belong to any of my friends, and the quiet whisper that I will never be able to explain. It turns out that when you hide in the dark woods, you never really know who else is hiding right there with you. Fast forward to last July, and another terrifying encounter reminded me that danger doesn't just lurk in the suburban streets or the deep woods. Sometimes, it walks right up to your front door in broad daylight. It was an incredibly hot Saturday afternoon, and I was 14 years old at the time. I live in a very rural part of Pennsylvania, where the properties are massive and spread out. My backyard is absolutely huge, consisting of acres of open grass, clusters of old trees, and an old wooden storage shed sitting right at the very edge of our property. My friends and I spent almost every single day of the summer hanging out in that yard. On this particular Saturday, it was me, my friends Ryan, Josh, and Adam. We had been playing basketball for about an hour on the hoop my dad had set up near the gravel driveway. We were playing 21 and horse, laughing and arguing over foul calls. We were completely exhausted, sweaty, and sitting in the grass, drinking cold water when we noticed a kid walking up from the dirt road that runs past my house. He looked to be about 16 years old, which made him older and significantly taller than any of us. He had messy black hair, and he was wearing a gray t-shirt and long blue jeans, which seemed incredibly uncomfortable given how hot and humid it was outside. We all stopped talking and watched him approach. He walked up to us with a strange level of confidence, acting as if he already knew us. He looked at the basketball in Adam's hands and asked if we wanted to even out the teams and play a game of 3-on-3. None of us answered right away because we were all caught off guard by his sudden appearance. Finally, Adam spoke up and asked him who he was and where he lived. The kid smiled and said his name was Keith. He claimed that he lived just a little way up the dirt road and had been walking through the woods when he heard us playing. We all looked at each other, feeling a bit uneasy. I had lived in that house my entire life, and my friends lived nearby, but none of us had ever seen this kid a single time in our lives. Still, he seemed normal enough, and we didn't want to be rude. Ben asked him if he wanted to play basketball, but Keith shook his head. Instead, he suggested we play a game of manhunt. He looked around my property and remarked that my yard was absolutely perfect for it, because there were so many great spots to hide. In that moment, none of us gave his comment a second thought. But in hindsight, that should have been a massive red flag. How would a kid who supposedly just walked out of the woods know anything about the layout of my family's property? Despite the slight weirdness, we all agreed to play, because manhunt sounded much more exciting than basketball in the heat. We split up into two teams. Keith immediately and enthusiastically volunteered to be on the hunting team. He said he absolutely loved being the seeker. So the teams were set. Keith, Adam, and Josh were the hunters, while myself, Ryan, and Ben were the hiders. Adam kicked a soccer ball into the air to signal the official start of the game. We hiders immediately scattered across the yard, while the hunters covered their eyes near the garage and began to count. Ryan took off sprinting toward the tree line, then doubled back to hide behind the side of the garage. I decided I didn't want to go into the thick woods just yet, so I ran straight to the old storage shed at the edge of the property. I pulled the rusty metal latch on the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The shed always smelled strongly of gasoline, old lawnmowers, and dusty wood. Spiderwebs hung from the wooden rafters, and rusted tools lined the walls. In the far corner, I spotted a large pile of folded blue plastic tarps. I quickly crawled behind them, pulling one of the heavy tarps over my body so that I was completely hidden from view and lay perfectly still. I stayed under that tarp for at least 10 minutes, and in the dark, suffocating heat of the shed, it felt like an absolute eternity. Nobody came near the shed. I was starting to think that the hunters had completely given up on searching this far out when the wooden door of the shed suddenly creaked open. Before I could even react, the heavy blue tarp was violently ripped off my body in one quick, aggressive motion. I blinked in the sudden light, expecting to see Keith, but it was just Adam standing there with a huge grin on his face. He laughed and told me it was a pretty obvious hiding spot. We both walked back to the concrete patio near the house, and a few minutes later, Ben showed up, having been caught by Josh. Eventually, Adam and Josh walked back to join us. We stood around the patio, drinking water and catching our breath, but Keith was nowhere to be found. At first, none of us thought much of it, but after another 10 minutes passed, Josh asked where Keith had gone. None of us had an answer. We waited for another 10 minutes, expecting him to walk out of the woods at any second, but the yard remained completely empty. Adam finally shrugged his shoulders and suggested that maybe he was just a weird kid who got bored and decided to walk home without saying goodbye. The rest of us agreed, even though the whole situation felt incredibly strange and unsettling. When the others left and the sun began to set, my friends all went home, and I headed inside to get some dinner. As I walked past my bedroom window on the side of the house, I noticed something odd lying in the grass. It was a thick, weathered piece of dirty rope. It looked like it had been sitting outside in the dirt for months, but I knew for an absolute fact that it had not been lying under my window earlier that afternoon. I picked it up, feeling a strange shiver of unease, and tossed it into the trash can. But the thought of that rope stuck in my mind. A terrifying thought began to form. What if Keith hadn't left the property? What if, while we were all distracted playing the game, he had actually gone inside my house? My dad always kept one of the side doors unlocked during the day so we could easily go in and out. The fear became too much to ignore, so I went room by room, checking every single closet, looking under every bed, and even checking behind the shower curtains. I found absolutely nothing, and I eventually managed to calm myself down, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That night, I got ready for bed around 11 o'clock. I lay in the dark for about an hour, scrolling through my phone when I heard a sound that made my heart leap into my throat. It was the sound of soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway directly outside my closed bedroom door. I froze, my eyes wide in the dark. My dad sometimes got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, but he was a loud man who always coughed or cleared his throat. These footsteps were incredibly quiet, deliberate, and stealthy. I called out, asking if it was my dad. There was absolutely no answer. I sat up in bed, my pulse racing at a terrifying speed. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I could see the shadow of feet blocking the sliver of light under the door. Panic took over. I quietly slid out of bed, rushed to the door, and locked it as silently as I could. I stood there, holding my breath, staring at the brass handle, waiting for it to turn. After about 30 seconds of agonizing silence, I heard the heavy sound of the front door downstairs clicking open and then shutting. The sound echoed clearly through the quiet house. I didn't waste a single second. I ran straight to my dad's bedroom, shook him awake, and frantically explained what had just happened. My dad saw the sheer terror in my eyes and didn't doubt me for a second. He immediately reached under his bed, pulled out his shotgun, and told me to stay close behind him. Together, we searched the entire house. We checked every closet, the dark basement, and the garage, but found no one. My dad even went outside with a powerful flashlight and walked the entire perimeter of the property, but the yard was completely empty. We locked every single door and window after that, and I barely slept a wink. The next day, I met up with my friends and told them what had happened. They all laughed it off, saying Keith was probably just some weird teenager who was playing a prank on us. But Ryan admitted that he had found Keith incredibly strange during the game, noting that the kid barely spoke a word and just stared at us with a cold, blank expression. That night, the fear returned. I lay in bed, unable to close my eyes. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, a soft, scratching sound woke me from a light doze. It was coming from directly outside my bedroom window. I froze, staring at the thin plastic blinds. The scratching was slow and rhythmic, like someone was dragging a fingernail or a small metal nail back and forth across the glass. I desperately did not want to look, but the curiosity and terror got the best of me. I slowly crept out of bed, approached the window, and carefully bent one of the blinds open just a tiny crack. On the other side of the glass, standing inches away in the pitch blackness, was a tall figure. I couldn't make out the face, but the shape of the body was unmistakable. It was the silhouette of a tall boy, and I was certain it was Keith. I let out a loud, blood-curdling scream and ran out of my room, shouting for my dad. My dad came rushing out of his room, holding his shotgun. He didn't hesitate. He ran out the back door and fired 2 loud rounds straight into the night air, screaming at the top of his lungs that he would shoot whoever was out there if they ever dared to come back. The figure at my window vanished into the darkness of the woods. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the brightly lit living room while my dad kept watch by the window, his shotgun resting on his lap. The next morning, my dad told me he was convinced that Keith was the one who had been stalking our house, and he warned me that the kid was never allowed near our property again. As far as I know, Keith never did return. But sometimes when I stand outside near my window at night, my eyes drift down to the grass where I found that dirty, weathered piece of rope, and I can't help but wonder what Keith was planning to do with it if I hadn't locked my door that night. It turns out that these simple, innocent childhood games we all play, games designed to bring us joy and excitement, can sometimes open a door to the darkest parts of the world. They show us that while we are busy hiding in the dark, laughing and waiting to be found, there might be someone else out there in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to find us. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to make a massive change in my life. I packed up everything I owned into the back of my old sedan and moved to a very small, quiet town in rural Illinois. At the time, I only knew one single person in the entire area, and being a pretty quiet, introverted guy in my early 20s, making new friends was not exactly easy for me. To make things even more challenging, the town was mostly made up of retired folks, so there was not exactly a bustling social scene for someone my age. My only friend in town, a girl I will call Clara, noticed that I was struggling to adjust and wanted to help me find a way to make some extra money and maybe build some local connections. One afternoon, Clara called me up and told me about an older couple in their early 50s who lived just outside of town and were desperately looking for a trustworthy dog sitter. She figured it would be the perfect low-stress gig for me, especially since I worked from home and could easily watch the dogs while doing my regular job. I thought it sounded like a great opportunity, so we set up a time for me to go over to their house, meet the owners, and get a feel for the property. The drive out to their house was long and winding. The property was situated in a highly secluded area, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to isolate it completely from the rest of the world. When I finally pulled up the driveway, I saw a large, brick ranch-style house that looked straight out of the 1970s. It was severely outdated, and you could tell that certain parts of the structure were starting to fall apart, but I actually found it somewhat charming. In my spare time, I loved to go urban exploring and look inside abandoned buildings, so an old, slightly run-down house did not bother me in the least. The couple met me at the front door, and while they were friendly enough, I immediately noticed some highly unusual behavior. Instead of making normal eye contact with me while we were talking, both of the owners kept doing this strange, slow, full body scan of me, almost as if they were sizing me up or trying to calculate something. It made me feel incredibly self-conscious and a bit uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself they were probably just protective of their home. As they began to show me around the house, they did not really say much of anything. They would simply walk me to a room, open the door, stand there in complete silence while I looked inside, and then close the door before moving to the next one. It was one of the most awkward home tours I had ever experienced. During the tour, I also noticed something else that was hard to ignore. This couple ran a side business selling firearms directly out of their home. Now, I did not really have an issue with that, but what did make me uncomfortable was the sheer number of security cameras they had set up. There were cameras absolutely everywhere. They were positioned outside the house, in the hallways, the living room, the kitchen, the office, the garage, the backyard, the driveway, and there was even one pointed directly at the kitchen table. When I asked about them, the husband laughed and told me it was purely for insurance purposes, because of their firearm business. While that explanation made logical sense, having that many lenses tracking my every move made me feel like I was going to be living in a fishbowl. Still, I was desperate for the extra income and wanted to establish myself in this new town, so I agreed to the job. The couple was scheduled to go on vacation for an entire week, leaving me alone with their two sweet dogs. When the day finally arrived, the couple departed early in the morning, and I moved my things into their house. Since I worked from home, I decided to set up my temporary workspace in their home office. The office actually had a large monitor that displayed the feeds from all of the outdoor security cameras simultaneously. This turned out to be a bit of a relief because being alone on a massive, isolated property in the middle of nowhere could get a little spooky, and having eyes on the entire perimeter made me feel much more secure. Another thing to note was that the dogs had a doggy door installed, which allowed them to go outside into the fenced backyard 24 hours a day. The backyard backed up directly to the dense dark woods, and during the daytime, the view was beautiful. But once the sun went down, those woods looked like a black wall. The first night went by without any issues. I worked, hung out with the dogs, and slept soundly. But on the second night, things took a turn. I was sitting at the desk in the office around 10 in the evening when I glanced over at the security monitor and noticed that the camera watching the driveway had gone completely offline. I did not panic because I knew that wireless internet out in rural areas could be incredibly spotty and finicky. However, being the responsible house sitter, I decided I should go ahead and check on it, just in case the camera had physically fallen from its mount or something had damaged it. As I stood up and started walking toward the front door, I suddenly heard the dogs scramble frantically off the living room floor. They bolted through the doggy door into the backyard, barking louder and more aggressively than I had ever heard them bark before. The sudden noise in the dead of night sent a massive jolt of adrenaline through my body. I walked quickly to the back door, hoping to call the dogs back inside before they disturbed any distant neighbors or, worse, got into a fight with a wild animal. When I peered through the glass of the back door, I could see both dogs standing at the far end of the yard, pressed against the wooden fence that bordered the woods. They were barking furiously at one exact spot in the tree line. I stared into the darkness, straining my eyes to see if there was a deer, a raccoon, or maybe a stray dog out there, but I could not see a single thing. My mind immediately began to play tricks on me, conjuring up scenes from every horror movie I had ever watched. I knew I had to get the dogs back inside immediately so I could lock the door and calm down. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed a handful of high-value dog treats, and managed to lure them back into the house. Once they were safely inside, I decided I was not taking any chances. I grabbed a heavy wooden chair from the dining room, shoved it tightly against the doggy door to completely block it off, and went to bed, trying to convince myself it was just a wild animal. The next morning, I woke up much later than I had intended. I felt completely thrown off and realized I had to jump straight into a work meeting before I even had time to feed the dogs. As I sat in bed opening my laptop, I suddenly realized how quiet the house was. Normally, the dogs would be jumping on the bed or nudging my arm for breakfast, but they were nowhere to be found. I got out of bed, walked down the hallway, and called their names, but there was no response. My heart began to beat a little faster as I made my way toward the back of the house. I looked out the window, and to my absolute shock, I saw both dogs casually trotting around the backyard, doing their usual morning routine. At first, my brain could not process what I was seeing, and then a wave of cold dread washed over me. How on earth did they get outside? I had blocked the doggy door with a heavy wooden chair the night before. I slowly turned my head to the right, looking toward the spot where the doggy door was located. My heart sank, and I felt all of the blood completely rush from my head. The heavy chair that I had pushed tightly against the doggy door was no longer there. It was now sitting neatly in the far corner of the room, 5 feet away from the door. A feeling of absolute panic set in. There was absolutely no physical way those dogs, even working together, could have moved that heavy chair 5 feet across the room and placed it neatly in the corner. Someone had to have moved it. Someone had been inside the house while I was sleeping. Shaking, I grabbed my phone and called Clara, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation. I told her I was terrified and needed her to come over immediately to help me search the house. Clara could hear the sheer terror in my voice and promised she would be there in 20 minutes. While I waited, I stood right by the front door, ready to run outside if I heard even the slightest sound from within the house. When Clara arrived, I let her in, and we immediately began a meticulous, room-by-room walkthrough of the entire house. We checked every single closet, looked under every bed, and even searched the crawl spaces, but we found absolutely nothing. The house was completely empty. Clara, trying to be the voice of reason, suggested that perhaps I had been so tired the night before that I had not actually pushed the chair as far over as I thought I did. She suggested that maybe the dogs had nudged it just enough to squeeze through. Deep down, I knew that was impossible, but because I did not want to seem like a paranoid coward, I decided to just accept her explanation. I told myself I would just have to push through the next 4 days of the job by staying on an incredibly high alert. Clara left, and I went back to my work, trying my best to settle my frayed nerves. The rest of the day went by quietly. The silence of the rural property actually began to feel peaceful again, and I started to relax as the afternoon faded into the evening. I made myself some dinner, finished up my work tasks, and went back to the office to check the security monitor one last time before bed. As I looked at the screen, my stomach completely dropped. Every single camera view on the monitor was black. All 4 cameras had gone completely offline at the exact same time. I knew that a single camera going down could be attributed to poor internet connection, but all 4 going down simultaneously was a statistical impossibility. This had to be intentional. Because of the nature of the couple's business and the fact that they had high-value firearms on the property, I felt a responsibility to let them know. I sent a text message to the wife, explaining that all of their security cameras had suddenly gone down and offering to troubleshoot the system for them if they wanted. More than anything, I wanted those cameras back up because I hated the idea of being completely blind to what was happening outside in the dark. I waited for a couple of hours, but I received no response. I figured they were on vacation, probably asleep or enjoying themselves, so I would just have to suck it up and wait until morning. By midnight, I was lying in bed with the television on, using the background noise to drown out the oppressive silence of the empty house. Suddenly, the dogs bolted upright. They scrambled out of the bed and ran frantically toward the back of the house. My heart began pounding violently against my ribs. I knew deep in my gut that something was horribly wrong. I reached down, grabbed a large kitchen knife that I had placed on the nightstand, and crept slowly out of the bedroom. I walked toward the back door, peering out into the dark yard. The dogs had already stopped barking, and were now just pacing back and forth, sniffing along the wooden fence. I opened the door slightly and tried to whisper-yell to get them to come back inside, but just as I did, a loud, heavy thump echoed from the complete opposite side of the house. I froze in place. My mind was racing, forced to make a split-second decision. Do I stay here and try to get the dogs in, or do I go investigate the source of that terrifying noise? I decided to get the dogs inside first, dragging them into the living room and sliding the heavy chair back in front of the doggy door. This time, I pulled out my phone and took a clear photo of the chair blocking the door, just to prove to myself later that I had actually done it. With the knife tightly gripped in my hand, I made my way toward the back room where the thump had originated. The moment I stepped into the hallway leading to that room, I felt a physical shift in the air. It is hard to describe to someone who has never experienced it, but when there is another human presence in a room, the atmosphere completely changes. The air feels heavier, and there is a sort of subtle white noise in the silence, a tiny break in the stagnancy of the empty space. I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was not alone. I was not about to walk blindly into the dark room to investigate, so I stood in the hallway and called out, asking who was there and what they were doing. My words were met with absolute silence. I then called out the names of the homeowners, thinking that maybe they had returned early from vacation and were playing some sort of bizarre prank on me, but again, nothing but silence. I thought about calling Clara, but she had a young child and a husband, and I did not want to wake her up over what might turn out to be nothing. I also thought about calling the police, but a sudden wave of embarrassment washed over me. I imagined the officers arriving, finding absolutely nothing, and thinking I was just a paranoid idiot who could not handle being alone in an old house. I slowly backed out of the hallway, reached out, quietly closed the door to that back room, and locked it from the outside. I went back to the living room, sat on the couch with the dogs, and sat there with my phone in one hand and the kitchen knife in the other, completely unable to decide what to do next. About 20 minutes passed in agonizing silence. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. It was a text message from the wife. The text read, "Hi, don't worry about the cameras, you are safe." I stared at the screen, completely thrown off. First of all, they were vacationing in Florida, which meant it was almost 2 in the morning where they were. Why was she texting me so late? And more importantly, why did she say I was safe? I had only texted her about the cameras being down. I had never mentioned anything about feeling unsafe. It was an incredibly bizarre choice of words. I started typing out a generic polite reply, but before I could hit send, another text message from her popped up on my screen. The text read, "Also, can you make sure that I didn't leave the garage door open to the inside? I don't want anything getting in." My chest tightened. The door she was referring to, the one leading from the garage into the house, was located inside that exact back room where I had heard the loud thump and felt that terrifying presence. There was absolutely no way I was going to go back into that room. I decided to simply ignore the message, pretending that I had already fallen asleep and had not seen it. But just 2 minutes later, she texted again. It read, "Hi, I know it is late, but can you please check on this for me as I am worried?" My gut was absolutely screaming at me not to go. Every survival instinct I had was telling me to stay on that couch. But then, a small part of my brain tried to rationalize the situation. What if a wild animal had indeed gotten into the garage and was trying to claw its way into the house? What if that was the thump I heard? With my phone and knife still tightly gripped, I slowly stood up and walked back toward the locked door of the back room. As I approached the door, I stopped and pressed my ear against the wood. I heard a faint, distinct shuffling sound coming from the other side. I stood there, completely paralyzed, trying to decide if I should open it. Suddenly, my phone screen lit up in my hand with another text message from the wife. It read, "I see you are up. Can you please go in and check?" I felt a wave of icy terror wash over me. I had completely forgotten that they had security cameras inside the hallway and the living room. The cameras inside were still working, and they were actively watching me. Why were they watching me on their security feed at 1 in the morning, while they were supposed to be on vacation in Florida? And why were they pushing me so aggressively to open that specific door? Realizing that I was being watched, and feeling an immense pressure to comply, I reluctantly unlocked the door and pushed it open. I stretched my arms out as far as they could go, keeping myself as far back from the threshold as possible to get a wide view of the room. The room was dark, and I could not hear or see anything unusual. I took 2 slow, cautious steps into the room. The door to the garage was indeed standing wide open, revealing a yawning black void. It was pitch black inside the garage, and I had no desire to get any closer to it. But just as I was about to turn around and run, my phone screen lit up with another notification. The faint blue glow from the screen cast a tiny bit of light into the open doorway of the garage. Just 2 steps away from me, in the dim light, I saw the clear, unmistakable outline of a human arm pressed flat against the wall right next to the doorframe. Someone was hiding just inside the garage, waiting for me to walk through the door. My fight or flight response kicked in with absolute blinding intensity. I did not think. I simply spun on my heel, bolted out of the room, slammed the door shut behind me, and locked it. I sprinted into the kitchen, grabbed my car keys off the counter, and ran straight out the front door into the cold night air. My hands were shaking so violently that I fumbled with the keys, struggling to unlock my car. As I finally got the door open and climbed inside, I glanced back at the house. The large garage door was slowly opening, lifting halfway up into the air. I started my car, and as the headlights flicked on, they illuminated the interior of the partially opened garage. There, in the far corner, squatting behind a cardboard box right next to the door I had been about to close, was a grown man wearing a dark jacket. I did not waste a single fraction of a second. I slammed the car into reverse, floored the gas pedal, and went flying down the long driveway. I drove directly to the nearest police station, tears of pure terror streaming down my face. When I burst through the doors of the station, I was hyperventilating, barely able to form coherent sentences. I managed to explain to the officers what had happened, and they immediately dispatched a unit to go check out the property. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot, my body shaking uncontrollably. I decided to text the wife, telling her that there was an intruder in her house, and asking her to check the security cameras to see if she could see him. I received absolutely no response. About half an hour later, the police officer returned to the station. He walked over to my car and told me that the garage door was indeed wide open when they arrived, but the house was completely clear. There were no signs of a forced entry, and they had checked the entire perimeter of the yard and found nothing out of the ordinary. The officer could see that I was completely out of my mind with fear, so he kindly offered to let me follow him back to the property, so he could do one final walkthrough with me there to prove it was safe. Once we did the search, and I saw with my own eyes that no one was inside, the officer wished me a good night and left. I knew there was absolutely no way I was going to be able to sleep. It was already approaching 4 in the morning, so I just lay on the living room couch with the dogs, wide awake, my fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of the kitchen knife. About 20 minutes after the police officer left, my phone buzzed with another text from the wife. It read, "Hi, plans changed. We will be home soon. You can go home now." I stared at the message in utter disbelief. They were completely disregarding the fact that a terrifying intruder had just been inside their home, a situation that I had literally just texted her about. Furthermore, they were suddenly coming home 4 days early, without warning, and would be there in just a couple of hours. I did not want to spend another second trying to analyze their bizarre behavior. I grabbed my bags, loaded them into my car, and left. The home was located on a secluded rural road, about a quarter of a mile from the main street. As I drove down the road and approached the stop sign, I happened to glance in my rearview mirror. My heart stopped. A dark car, driving with its headlights completely turned off, slowly pulled into the couple's driveway. I quickly grabbed my phone and sent a text to the wife, saying that someone had just pulled into her driveway as I was leaving. Almost instantly, a reply popped up on my screen. It read, "I know." Chills ran down my spine, and a sickening realization washed over me. They were setting me up. They had been in the area the entire time. They had never been in Florida. The dogs barking in the middle of the night on the previous days had been alerting me to the fact that they were driving their car along the hidden path behind the woods. They had intentionally shut off the outdoor security cameras, so I could not see them creeping around the property while I was inside. Completely oblivious. They had used the indoor cameras to watch my movements and tried to bait me into the dark garage where that man was waiting. I never heard from that couple ever again. Clara profusely apologized to me, swearing up and down that she had no idea how deeply disturbed they were. She told me she only knew them as regular customers who came into the local diner where she worked. After that terrifying incident, Clara said she never saw them come into the diner again. I am 30 years old now, and I still struggle to process what happened to me that night. I know that I am safe now, but the realization that I was just seconds away from God knows what is a feeling that I can never shake. A few years after that incident, I moved to a busy suburb just outside of Baltimore and took a job working as a bartender at a local bar and restaurant. To understand this next experience, you really have to understand the unique layout of the place. It was a very popular spot, but it had a highly unconventional way of operating. There were absolutely no waiters or waitresses on staff. Instead, there were only bartenders like myself and the kitchen cooks in the back. If a customer wanted to order food or non-alcoholic drinks, they had to walk up to the bar, place their order directly with us, and then pick it up from the counter when it was ready. I never quite understood why management chose to run the place this way, though I suspect it was just a cheap tactic to avoid paying a full waitstaff. Despite the odd setup, it kept the work incredibly fast-paced, which I actually really enjoyed. The place was constantly packed, especially on the weekends. The atmosphere was always incredibly lively, with great music playing, a buzzing crowd, and a large standing area near the DJ booth where people would gather to dance and socialize. Because of the constant flow of people, my shifts usually flew by, and since I love talking to new people, it was pretty much the perfect gig for me. I would have probably lost my mind if I had to stand around waiting for hours between serving customers. One particular weekend night started off like any other. It was a Friday, which meant we were gearing up for a massive rush. By 9 in the evening, the bar was completely slammed. It was a heavily college-aged crowd that night, which always meant a rowdier environment, lots of spilled drinks, and unfortunately, much smaller tips. I was running around behind the bar, trying to keep up with a group of kids who kept ordering endless rounds of tequila shots, when I happened to glance across the room. I saw an elderly couple walk through the front door and make their way toward a booth in the far corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing particularly strange about them. I just found it a little interesting that two people of their advanced age would choose to come into such a loud, chaotic, and rowdy bar on a Friday night. I did not have much time to dwell on it, so I immediately went back to pouring drinks. About 45 minutes to an hour passed. I was in the middle of mixing a long line of gin and tonics, my hands moving on pure muscle memory, when my eyes drifted back over to that corner booth. The moment I looked at them, my brain froze. The elderly couple was sitting completely motionless. They had not ordered any food, and they did not have any drinks on their table. I knew for a fact that they had not come up to the bar to order, because I would have remembered serving them. But what was even stranger was that they were not even looking at each other. They were both sitting perfectly upright, staring intently at the blank wall directly next to their booth. They were not talking, they were not moving, and they did not appear to be paying any attention to the loud music or the crowd around them. It was one of the most bizarre things I had ever seen. I was incredibly curious, but the bar was still slammed, so I had to put it out of my mind and keep working. When the rush finally started to slow down a bit, I decided to go over and check on them. I figured they might be first-time visitors who did not understand that we did not have waiters, and they were probably just waiting for someone to take their order. I put on my best customer service smile and walked over to their table. As I approached, neither of them turned their heads to acknowledge me. They remained completely still, staring at the wall like a pair of wax statues. I cleared my throat politely and asked if I could get them anything to eat or drink. The woman did not even flinch. She did not blink. She did not move. She just kept her eyes locked on the wall. The man, however, slowly began to turn his head toward me. His movements were incredibly slow, almost like he was moving underwater. When his face finally came into full view, a cold shiver ran straight down my spine. His skin was incredibly pale, almost gray and heavily wrinkled. His eyes were deeply sunken into his skull, looking like two dark hollows. He did not say a word. He just stared at me with an incredibly intense, vacant gaze, and then shook his head once, very firmly and silently. Something about his expression and the general energy coming off of him made my stomach instantly twist into a knot. I mumbled a quick apology, turned around, and practically sprinted back to the safety of the bar. I could not shake the incredibly weird feeling in my gut. Those people did not look like they belonged in a rowdy college bar. Honestly, they did not look like they belonged in this century. I deliberately avoided looking over at that corner booth for the next hour, focusing entirely on my work. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I glanced over toward their table, and the moment I did, I nearly dropped the glass I was drying. Both the man and the woman had turned their bodies completely around in the booth, and were now staring directly at me. They were not blinking. They were just staring at me with those vacant, hollow eyes. I tried to make direct eye contact with the woman, hoping she would look away out of politeness, but she did not avert her gaze for even a second. It was the most uncomfortable and deeply unsettled I had ever felt in my life. I quickly looked away, pretending to clean the taps, and tried my best to ignore them. By the time I finally gathered the courage to look back over, the booth was completely empty. They were gone. A massive wave of relief washed over me. I was just incredibly glad that they had left. At the end of the shift, as I was wiping down the bar and closing up the register with my coworker Karen, I decided to bring it up. Karen was what you would call a veteran bartender. She had been working at this location for years, and prided herself on knowing every regular and noticing every single person who walked through the doors. I asked her if she had noticed that incredibly creepy elderly couple sitting in the corner booth earlier. Karen stopped counting her cash, gave me a highly confused look, and said she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. I told her they were sitting in the far corner booth for hours, not ordering anything, just staring at the wall. Karen shook her head firmly and said she had been watching that side of the room all night, and there had never been an elderly couple in that booth. She even joked that I must be hallucinating from working too many late shifts. I laughed along with her, but on the inside my mind was racing. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was absolutely sure, and she crossed her arms and easily listed off about 10 other customers who had been sitting in that general area, describing exactly what they were wearing and what they had ordered. There was no way Karen would have missed them. By the time we finished locking up the building, I had actually started to doubt my own sanity. I walked out to the parking lot, my mind a complete fog, but as I reached my car, I saw something that made me freeze in absolute terror. Across the street, standing directly under a single flickering streetlight, were two dark figures. Even in the dim light, I knew exactly who they were. It was the elderly couple. They were standing side by side, perfectly still, staring directly across the street at me. I wanted to scream, but my throat was completely dry. I did not wait another second. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sped out of the parking lot as fast as my car would go, never looking back. The drive home was a nightmare. I kept crying, repeating the words, "Oh my God," over and over again. I had so many terrifying questions. Did Karen really not see them? Were they even real people? Was I losing my mind? I never saw those people again, and I never got an explanation. It is a mystery that still haunts me to this day. A few years later, I met a guy who became one of my closest friends. He told me a story about his father that was so deeply unsettling it has stayed with me ever since. His father worked as a logger in the dense, isolated forests of the Pacific Northwest. Specifically, he was a tree saw operator, which meant he operated a massive, incredibly dangerous machine designed to cut down giant trees and slice them to specific lengths. The job required long, grueling hours of intense physical labor, and he was often completely alone in some of the most remote wilderness areas in the country, because the logging crew was paid based on the volume of wood they cleared, rather than the hours they worked. His father would often push himself to work 16 to 20-hour days to finish jobs ahead of schedule. Once he and his partner finished cutting down the trees, the rest of the heavy crew would come in with trucks to transport the timber to the mill. His father spent about half of his time working entirely alone, but the other half was spent working alongside his close friend Griffin, who was also a tree saw operator. Because they were often positioned on opposite ends of a massive job site, they relied heavily on two-way radios to communicate. Several years ago, his father and Griffin were assigned to a highly remote job site located high up on an isolated mountain. The location was so inaccessible that it took the logging company's road crew over 3 weeks just to clear a dirt path wide enough for their heavy equipment to reach the site. By the time they actually began cutting timber, they were miles away from any form of civilization, surrounded by nothing but endless, dense forest. They were about 10 days into the job, making excellent progress, when they suddenly started hearing strange, faint chatter coming over their two-way radios. At first, the voices were incredibly muffled and distorted by static, making it impossible to understand what was being said. They tried switching to different channels, but to their confusion, the strange chatter seemed to follow them, no matter which frequency they chose. Anyone who has ever used standard radio equipment knows that this should be technically impossible unless someone was actively scanning and matching their channels. As they moved further up the mountain, clearing trees as they went, the voices on the radio became clearer and more distinct. They still could not make out full, coherent conversations, but the general tone of the voice fragments they captured felt deeply off. His father said the voices sounded almost entirely casual, yet the content of what they were saying remained completely unintelligible, almost like they were speaking in a strange code or a language he had never heard before. To make matters worse, they also started finding physical signs that other people were living on the mountain. They found random plastic containers left in the brush, strange footprints in the mud, and small, crude makeshift campsites hidden deep in the trees. Given how incredibly remote and inaccessible this area was, these discoveries were deeply alarming. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to be up there. One afternoon, Griffin was working near a hidden game trail when he spotted a small, camouflage tent pitched deep in the thicket. He immediately radioed his father, and the two of them decided to go investigate. They approached the tent cautiously, calling out to see if anyone was inside, but there was no response. They decided to open the flap and look inside. Inside the tent, they found a single sleeping bag and a large duffel bag. When they zipped open the duffel bag, they were met with some of the most horrifying and disturbing items imaginable. The bag was filled with multiple pairs of children's underwear. I joined a gym for the first time 3 months ago. A gym is really the last place you would ever expect something scary to happen. But last week I had the most horrific experience of my life. I wear wireless headphones when I go to the gym because the wired ones always get in the way, and they are just annoying. Sometimes I will leave my phone on a workout machine when I walk to the water fountain, and when the phone gets too far from the headphones start getting staticky before disconnecting. I only knew because it happened a couple of times before, when I walked away too far from my phone in the gym. Well, one late night last week, I was one of the last people still in the gym. I was on one of the seated leg machines. I began my set of 20. While I was pushing towards my final reps, the music in my headphones started getting staticky. That is how my headset said disconnected from phone. I stopped my set and reached over to the phone compartment on top of the machine, and I filled with worry when I could not feel my phone. It was not there. I looked around the gym desperately, thinking someone might have taken it. I only saw 2 other people in the whole gym, excluding the guy sitting at the front desk. One guy was really fat and sweaty, and the other guy was sitting on one of the machines looking down on his phone. Which one could have taken my phone? I had to approach the guy sitting on his phone as much as I did not want to. He had earbuds in, so when I approached him, he looked at me with a confused look on his face. He took one earbud out and looked at me, and I firmly asked him if he took my phone. He looked at me in silence for a couple of seconds, then said no. There was obvious attitude. I asked him if he saw anyone else walking by recently, and he just shook his head no. For some dumb reason, I said thanks and walked away, when deep down I wanted to tell him to quit being a jerk. I went to the front desk and asked the worker to check the video cameras and see once and for all who actually took my phone. The worker turned the computer screen so that I could see it, and clicked play on a video which showed the guy who left 15 seconds ago taking my phone. I thanked the employee and ran to catch the guy who just left. But by the time I got outside, the guy was nowhere to be found. The scary thing that sunk in right away was the fact that I recently disabled my passcode blocks on my phone, meaning he had access to all of my apps, all of my texts, pictures, emails, and all of my data. I went back inside and asked the employee to track that man's membership info. But when he checked the cameras, the guy did not even check in. He simply walked past the counter unnoticed. So, there were no records of this guy even being a member of the gym. The footage showed that he suspiciously walked around between machines, looking around a lot like a nervous person. I asked the employee to report that to the police. He said he would show it to his boss tomorrow. The next day, I called my best friend Tom so I could tell him why I would not be answering texts for a while, and to also see if he could tell all my other friends what happened. He started freaking out on the phone, begging me to tell him I was kidding about losing it. He told me someone had been sending him texts and came to his house. I did not understand, so he said he would be over to show me. 10 minutes later, Tom got to my house and showed me a long conversation between him and someone using my phone pretending to be me. It started out with a person on my phone saying, "Hey, can I stay at your place tonight? I got in a huge fight with my parents." Tom said, "Yeah, let me know when you come over." Then the guy who was using my phone said, "Can you just leave your back door open? I am going to be over super late and I do not want to wake you." The conversation went on a little while longer before Tom finally agreed to just leave his back door unlocked. Tom went back to sleep under the impression that it was actually me who would be coming through that back door. When we finished reading the conversation, Tom looked up at me and said the cameras. We rushed to his house together and watched the footage captured on the cameras throughout his house. I was disturbed, but also not surprised to see that man from the gym who took my phone walking in through the back door of Tom's house. He scavenges the place, grabbing expensive household objects and throwing them in his pockets. He moves from the den to the kitchen and eventually to the upstairs. I saw the fear in Tom's face when we watched the man on the camera on the upstairs hallway open his bedroom door, step inside for about 20 seconds, and come back out, leaving the door open. The man was in the house for about 10 minutes before sneaking back out the back door. It looked like he took a lot of valuables. Tom and I sent the video footage to the police. 3 months later, we have not heard a word from them. Whoever stole my phone and snuck into Tom's house got away with it. I currently go to a 24-hour gym in my town. It is usually on the quieter side most of the day, but during the night hours, it really becomes a ghost town. I do not quite understand how they could afford to stay open 24/7. I had to work late one night to cover for someone else's shift, so I got off work at 11 p.m. I planned on heading right over to the gym to get a quick midnight workout in. When I got there, nobody else was there. I was the only one working out. Well, only for about 10 minutes, and then I finally spotted someone else working out. It made me feel a little less odd for being there so late. The guy was wearing a beanie and a hoodie. I was sweating just looking at him, to be honest. I mean, yeah, it was cold out, but it was not cold in the gym. I barely had enough time to analyze his odd clothing decision before he started staring me down. I looked back for as long as I felt comfortable before deciding to look away. I felt like he seemed to be challenging my dominance, because I still felt his stare through my peripheral vision. I kept shooting brief looks back at him to still find him staring at me. I tried my best to ignore it and went on with my workout. I just could not take the staring anymore though, so I went to a different section of the gym where there was absolutely no one around. I was finally able to work out in peace. I was doing bicep curls by the free weights while facing the mirror. That is when I noticed it. That guy in the beanie was hiding behind one of the chest press machines. There was a slight opening between the lifting mechanism and the actual weights on the machine, and through that opening was the guy's face once again staring at me. I think when he realized that I noticed him, he moved away out of sight behind the machine. I am way too timid of a person to go approach anybody like that, so instead of confronting him, I put the weights down and left the room. I walked straight to the front desk and asked the girl working to tell the man to either stop staring at me like that or to leave the gym. She looked down the aisle of workout machines and saw nobody. I asked her to come follow me. She was clearly very reluctant to do so, but she ended up coming with me to the back room. We looked around the room, but he was not in there. In fact, it seemed like he was not even in the gym anymore. I apologized and told her to keep an eye out for the man in the beanie. She walked back to her desk, and I kept working out for another 10 to 15 minutes. I waved goodbye to the girl as I left the gym and went to my car. As I put the key in the door lock, I heard manic footsteps hitting the concrete. I was confused at first because it sounded like somebody running in my direction. I turned 180 degrees, and someone was sprinting towards me from the dark. I stood like an animal frozen in headlights for a second as I stared in shock. When the person emerged into the circle of light under the light post I was parked under, I was able to instantly recognize the guy in the beanie and hoodie from earlier. I opened the car door and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. I slammed my hand down on that tiny lock knob on top of the door handle a split second before the man tried to open the door. As I started the car, he started to kick at my door and window. I threw the handle into reverse and stepped on the gas. The car jolted backwards away from the man, and I was able to escape the parking lot safely. I got home and found a bunch of dents in my door from the man's kicks. Admittedly, I should have called the cops or even the gym and warned the girl of the man now that she was alone. Instead, I selfishly just went to bed and told myself I would never go to the gym late at night again. I used to work nights at a 24-hour fitness center in New Jersey. I had a love-hate relationship with these shifts. I loved it because very few people would come in during the deep night hours, meaning less people checking in and less weights I had to put back. I hated it because it meant I had to spend the graveyard hours sitting at a desk doing nothing while everybody else was asleep. Still, maybe you would think many strange things would happen during these hours, or maybe you wouldn't. It is a gym, so what could really happen? Actually, only one strange incident ever happened while I was working there. I was sitting in a chair behind the counter reading a magazine, and then out of natural curiosity, I turned to do a little people watching. Well, there was only one guy in the gym. He was not doing anything, though. He was kind of just pacing slowly down the gym, looking around. He made a left turn past the wall and disappeared from my view. So, it was back to reading for me. 10 minutes passed, and I forgot the guy was even there. Then suddenly, everything went dark and completely silence. Like literally, the power in the gym just shut out. All the lights turned off, and all the music went dead. It was so dark I could not see 2 feet in front of me. Thank God our phones have flashlights these days. Otherwise, I would not have known what to do. I turned my flashlight on and tried to think of what I should do next. I knew some kind of power box was in one of the storage rooms connected to the back section of the gym. I also knew that was exactly where the one guy working out happened to be. On my way there, with my phone flashlight in hand, I called out for the patron over and over. Now I was in the back section, still calling for him. Why on earth would he not answer me? There was something so eerie about being in a silent, pitch-black gym and seeing all the workout equipment only through a flashlight. I found the power box in the back storage area, or at least what I thought was the power box. I tried flicking on and off every possible combination of switches, but the power did not come back on. Since I could not figure it out, I guessed it was on me to close up shop and wait for Kathy, the owner, to come fix it tomorrow morning. But first, I had to find that guy. I did a thorough scan of the whole back section, behind all the equipment and all the janitorial closets, but found nothing. The only other place I could check back there was the women's bathroom. I opened the door and called for him once more. My voice echoed into the seemingly empty bathroom. Still, I had to double-check to confirm. I made sure to point the flashlight in every possible direction so I could see every inch of the bathroom. The only place left to check now was the stalls. Before I could open either of them, though, I started to hear noises. It was breathing noises, like sickly, deranged breathing noises. I had my hand on the door ready to push it open, but I could not bring myself to do it. I said, "Are you in there?" No answer. I got on my knees and looked under the stall door with my flashlight. There were two legs standing right behind the stall door, practically inches from my face. He was literally standing on the other side of the stall door. I quickly got up and left the room, my heart racing. I ran to the front desk and tried to figure out what to do. I tried calling the owner, also known as my boss, but obviously she was asleep by this time. I left 2 different voicemails on her phone. The only other thing I could think to do was call the cops, and so I did. I did not know what else to say other than there was a suspicious man in our gym, and I was 90% sure he had somehow cut the power. I hung up the phone and felt alone and horrified in the darkness and silence. Suddenly, a metallic hit sound came from across the dark gym, like one of the machine's weights being dropped. I shone the light down the gym and called for the patron once more, and then called out that we were closed and that he had to leave. Then, I think I saw him. I saw someone walking between 2 machines before getting too far from the light to see. It seemed like he was messing with me now. I shone the light in the direction that he was walking, and I swear to God it looked like just at the edge of the light, there was a face looking at me. The blue and red lights from the cop car outside lit up the front section of the gym briefly. A cop knocked on the front door, and I opened it to let him in. He took out his flashlight, greeted me, and said he would take a look around. He patrolled the whole entire gym, including bathrooms and closets, before coming back to me and saying it was empty. He suggested that whoever it was left through the back door, and that is exactly what I did. By the time I got back the next morning to check on things, Kathy was already there. Apparently, it was just a simple power outage the night previous. Kathy and I checked the camera footage together. In those brief moments before the power went out, we checked for the guy I described, but he was not there. There was no footage of him entering the gym. Kathy looked at me like I was crazy and asked if I was alone, but I was too frozen with shock and confusion to care. I swore up and down to her that someone was there that night. To this day, I do not know if she believed me. I do not even know what to think of that night, but I know I saw someone there, regardless of what the cameras might have shown. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. A couple of weeks ago, a college student was sitting in his room when his dad came home with an unexpected job offer. One of his dad's coworkers was leaving town for a few days and needed someone trustworthy to look after his house. The student was a computer science major, so his dad automatically assumed he could easily manage any kind of advanced technology in the home. And this house had plenty of it. The owner had set up a massive security system with cameras in almost every room. These feeds ran to a central operating desk in an upstairs bedroom, where live footage played on a large monitor. The owner offered the student $200 just to stay there for the weekend. To the student, this sounded like incredibly easy money. The next day, his dad drove him to the house and he met the owner. The man was friendly, but requested that the student spend most of his time upstairs in the monitoring room. The student did not mind. He brought his laptop, set up his schoolwork, and spent his hours typing away while watching television. On the first day, everything was completely normal. He barely looked at the security monitors. After all, it was a quiet neighborhood. But when night fell, he started wondering where he should sleep, since they had not discussed it. He sat down at the monitor desk to check which rooms had beds or comfortable couches. As his eyes scanned the grid of live video feeds, his heart suddenly skipped a beat. On the monitor showing the downstairs hallway, he noticed that the back screen door was standing wide open. He stared at the screen, trying to remember if it had been open earlier. He was almost positive it had been closed. Anxiety washed over him. He began flipping through each camera feed one by one. That was when he saw the living room monitor. A closet door that had definitely been shut earlier was now open. He froze in fear. He grabbed his phone and sent a quick text to his dad. asking him to contact the homeowner to see if he had returned early. While waiting for a reply, he kept his eyes glued to the dark living room screen. A tall figure, resembling a solid black shadow, stepped slowly out of the open closet. He gasped in shock and pulled his arms back, accidentally knocking a heavy metal object off the desk onto the floor. The heavy thud echoed loudly through the silent house. On the screen, the shadow figure instantly reacted to the noise. The person tilted their head up toward the ceiling, looking right toward the upstairs room. Then they began walking to the stairs, moving with terrifying slowness. Right then, his phone buzzed. His dad texted that the homeowner was definitely not back. The student scrambled to text his dad to send help immediately, losing track of the monitor in his panic. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the bedroom door. He looked up in horror. He glanced at the monitor and saw the tall, dark figure standing right outside his door. He remembered that this room had no lock. With his heart hammering, the only thing he could do was open the window and jump out into the bushes below. He scrambled out of the bushes, ran down the street, and met the police. When investigators reviewed the footage, they saw the intruder break the back glass, hide in the closet, and then stalk the student up the stairs before running off. Unfortunately, the footage was too dark to make out his face, and the intruder was never found. A few months later, another strange event occurred involving a young man who agreed to house sit and pet sit for a close friend's family. They were going away on a short weekend vacation. He was familiar with the layout of the house. The job was simple. He just had to feed 2 cats, some fish, and a few birds. The daytime passed without any issues. He fed the animals and spent the evening relaxing. At bedtime, he decided to sleep on the couch in the sunroom. The sunroom was surrounded by large glass windows on 3 sides, with a big television on the wall. He fell asleep with the television on, but woke up after midnight. The screen had turned off, leaving the room in complete darkness. He tried to close his eyes and go back to sleep, but the sudden silence made him uneasy. Then, he heard a distinct sound outside. It sounded like the latch of the backyard PVC gate clicking shut. He tried to convince himself it was just the wind, but he sat up and looked out into the dark yard. Then he heard the unmistakable, loud crunch of dry leaves right outside the window. He froze. He slowly leaned over to look out the window directly behind the couch. His breath caught in his throat. Right there, pressed flat against the glass, was a person staring directly into the dark room. He could not tell if the intruder could see him through the shadows, but the proximity was terrifying. He stood up and screamed at the top of his lungs for the person to get away. The intruder was quite large, so the young man had no intention of going outside to confront him. Surprisingly, the loud shouting did not scare the person away. Instead, they calmly walked over to the back door of the sunroom and began rattling the doorknob, trying to force it open. He ran into the main hallway to grab his phone. He turned back toward the sunroom and yelled that he was calling the police. Fortunately, this threat worked. Through the window, he saw the shadow run off into the darkness of the yard. Instead of calling the police, he texted his friend to let them know of the near break-in. He spent the rest of the night locked in an upstairs bedroom. The next morning, the family returned home. They walked out to find that all of the tires on their sedan had been slashed. They speculated that someone who held a grudge knew they were going on vacation and had planned a targeted break-in. When that failed, they settled for slashing the tires instead. Then there is the story of Sarah, a college student who used to babysit to make extra money. One day, she saw an ad posted in the local library requesting a house sitter for the weekend. The pay was good, and Sarah figured house sitting would be much easier than watching loud children. She called the number and spoke with a man named Chuck. They met that Friday. Chuck showed her around his massive, beautiful home. It was a stunning multi-story house with several empty guest rooms. Chuck and his wife packed their bags, said their goodbyes, and left. Sarah settled into one of the spare bedrooms upstairs and watched a movie. She wondered why a couple with no pets would pay someone $200 just to stay in their house, but assumed they simply wanted a sense of security while they were gone. By the time the movie ended, Sarah was exhausted. She turned off the television and laid down in the dark. Just as she was about to fall asleep, she heard a faint click. Suddenly, a thin line of bright light appeared under the closet door. Sarah opened her eyes and saw the light spilling out. Her heart rate skyrocketed to 200 beats a minute. She was completely paralyzed with fear. Instead of jumping out of bed, she instinctively rolled onto her side, pulled the blankets up to her chin, and pretended to be fast asleep. She was absolutely certain someone was hiding inside that closet. The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah lay there, trying to control her breathing. Then she heard the soft creak of the closet door opening. Because she was facing the opposite wall, she could not see who it was. She closed her eyes tightly, praying that the intruder would just leave. After a moment, she heard another click, and the room went completely dark. The closet door quietly shut again. Sarah lay perfectly still, her mind racing. Did the person go back inside the closet, or were they standing in the dark bedroom with her? Gathering her strength, she slowly rolled over to face the room. Standing right next to her bed was a tall figure. The person's hand was raised, reaching directly down toward her face. Sarah screamed, scrambled backward against the wall, and threw her blankets off. She hopped over the metal frame of the bed, sprinted out of the room, ran down the stairs, and fled out the front door. She did not stop running until she reached her own home. She called Chuck, told him there was an intruder, and hung up. She never wanted to see him or that house ever again. These haunting stories serve as a stark and chilling reminder that sometimes the empty houses we are paid to look after are not quite as empty as we are led to believe. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In 2018, my girlfriend and I decided we needed a break from our daily routines. Her name is Alicia, and after so many years together, a weekend getaway sounded perfect. We ended up finding this incredibly beautiful, highly secluded Airbnb in the Hamptons on Long Island. The house was a total dream, sitting right on the beach, where the back door led right to the dunes. During the day, the beach felt almost completely private. Every now and then, we might see a local going for a walk, but we were mostly entirely alone. On our second day, we decided to follow pretty much the same routine. We spent some time swimming in the backyard pool first, before heading out to the beach to lay on our towels and dry off under the sun. The house itself was absolutely gorgeous, with dense woods surrounding the property and the ocean just 10 steps from our back door. We lost track of time and stayed out on the beach for many hours, soaking in the sun until it was around 4 or 5 in the afternoon. As the temperature began to drop slightly, we started packing up our towels. I stood up and stretched my arms, looking back towards the massive house. My eyes stopped on one of the second-story windows, specifically the master bedroom. I froze. I thought for sure I could see the distinct silhouette of someone standing right at the glass, looking straight down at me. But the sun was at an angle that created a heavy glare on the windows, making it hard to tell if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I grabbed Alicia by the shoulder, pointing up at the window, and asked her if she saw that. She looked up but said she did not see anything. I looked back up, but whatever shape I thought I had seen was gone. I told Alicia to keep packing up while I ran back to check things out. I walked inside, ran up the stairs, and pushed open the master bedroom door. The room was completely empty. I checked the closet, looked under the bed, and walked through the other rooms, but there was nobody there. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioners. Then I heard the downstairs door open. It was just Alicia carrying our beach gear. Feeling a bit silly, I decided to just chalk it up to my eyes, playing tricks on me after lying in the sun. Fast forward to that night, which was our final night at the house. Because we knew we had to leave the next morning, we decided to stay out a little later. We went to a couple of the same local bars, enjoyed some drinks, and headed back. By the time we finally drove back, it was already around 11 o'clock. The house was pitch black. I tried to flick the living room light switch, but nothing happened. I looked over at the TV stand, and all the digital clocks were completely dead. The power to the house was out. We looked for a circuit breaker box, but in the dark, we could not find one. It was too late to call the homeowner, so we decided to just head upstairs. We pulled out our phones and used the flashlights to guide our steps, so we wouldn't trip on our faces going up the dark stairs. We got into the bedroom and climbed into bed. The alcohol in Alicia's system worked quickly, and within minutes she was completely knocked out, snoring softly beside me. I, on the other hand, lay there wide awake in the absolute darkness. And then I sat up. I felt a cold chill run down my spine because I heard a faint shuffling sound coming from just outside our bedroom door. I stared at the open doorway, my heart hammering. In the dim moonlight, I watched in absolute horror as a dark figure walked past the open doorway in the hallway. I instantly slammed my hands over my mouth to prevent a squeal of terror from escaping. I carefully lifted myself over Alicia, trying my best not to wake her. I slid off the bed and made a silent, desperate dash toward the bedroom door. The second I reached it, I grabbed the lock and twisted it shut, and then there was a sudden knock on the other side of the door. A voice from the dark hallway spoke, claiming to be the landlord who had come to fix the power. I did not believe it for a single second. Why would the landlord show up in the middle of the night without calling first? When I did not answer, the polite knocks turned into aggressive, heavy bangs. The wooden door started to shake violently. The man began twisting and shaking the doorknob with incredible force, trying to break his way inside. The sudden noise woke Alicia up. She sat up, completely disoriented, and immediately started to scream. I turned to her and screamed at the top of my lungs to call the cops. The sound of me yelling about the police seemed to startle the intruder because the violent shaking of the doorknob suddenly stopped. What followed was an agonizing period of waiting, in silence and fear. We sat there in the dark until we finally heard the sound of police sirens approaching. The officers arrived and entered the house through the front door, which they told us was left wide open. The police did a sweep, but the intruder had already vanished into the dark woods. They took a report and helped us find the circuit breaker box in the basement, restoring the power before they left. The very next morning, we packed our bags and left the Hamptons first thing. On the ride home, I called the landlord to demand answers, but he was completely shocked. He told me he had not been anywhere near the Hamptons for several weeks, and he had absolutely no idea who could have been inside the house. But that brings us to our next story, which shows how a simple teenage prank can go horribly wrong when you realize you have stepped directly into someone else's hiding spot. This event took place about 4 years ago, on a warm Monday evening that happened to be the 4th of July. I had just finished my sophomore year of high school, and my parents had grounded me a few days prior for some minor trouble, meaning I was strictly forbidden from going to any of the fun holiday parties. However, our neighbors decided to host a massive block party right outside in the cul-de-sac. Even though I was grounded, my parents basically forced me to come outside and join the gathering. I absolutely hate talking to older adults because I never have any idea what to say, but fortunately my close friend Eli lived in the same neighborhood. I called him over, and we ended up hanging out near the edge of the crowd. After a few minutes, Eli and I got extremely bored. The party was filled with middle-aged parents drinking beer, so there was absolutely nobody our own age to talk to. That was when Eli turned to me and asked if Savannah lived just a little further down the street. He suggested that we go and door ditch her house. For context, Savannah was the extremely popular girl at our high school that literally every guy had a massive crush on. It was already awkward enough that she and I were neighbors, but her dad also happened to be my family dentist. Despite the potential awkwardness, I agreed to the suggestion. We sneaked away from the block party and started walking down the street as the sun was setting quickly. Eli and I made dumb jokes to pass the time, laughing at things we found funny. To be honest, we were both pretty nerdy sophomores back then. I asked Eli if he knew exactly where her house was, and he pointed toward the west at a massive complex house. In our mediocre neighborhood in Michigan, a house of that scale was incredibly rare. We sneakily approached the property, walking along the edge of the lawn to avoid being seen. But as we got closer, we realized that the entire place was dark. There were no cars in the driveway, none of the interior lights were on, and there was absolutely no sign of life. Eli and I stood near the driveway, and we both agreed that Savannah and her family had probably gone out of town on a holiday trip. I suggested that we should just leave and come back next week to do the prank when they were actually home. But Eli was not listening to me. He kept staring at the dark house, drawn by curiosity. Before I could stop him, he walked right up to the front porch and reached out for the front door. I panicked and yelled at him to get back here, but Eli hissed at me to be quiet, and then he pushed the door. To our absolute shock, the heavy front door swung right open. The family had left it completely unlocked. Eli looked back at me, his face lighting up, and suggested we go inside and explore for just a minute. Being the curious, foolish teenagers we were, we decided to step inside. The interior of the house was pitch black and incredibly cold. Almost immediately, Eli and I split up to explore the enormous layout. As I walked through the dark, quiet rooms, a heavy sense of guilt started to wash over me. I realized that what we were doing was not just a harmless prank anymore. We had officially broken into someone's home and were completely invading their privacy. I stood in the middle of a dark hallway, seriously contemplating turning around and leaving. But then, a sudden blood-curdling scream from Eli shattered the silence. I sprinted toward the sound of his voice, my heart hammering. I found Eli running out of what appeared to be Savannah's bedroom. I grabbed his arm and asked him why on earth he was screaming. Without saying a word, Eli grabbed my shoulder and dragged me into the nearest bathroom. He slammed the heavy door shut, locked it, and began whispering in a panicked, shaking voice. He told me that there was someone hiding inside Savannah's bedroom closet, and they were watching him. I tried to calm him down, whispering that it was probably just a family member who had stayed behind. But Eli immediately shook his head and asked why a family member would be silently hiding in a young girl's bedroom closet in the pitch black. He had a point. The bedroom itself was decorated with entirely white walls. White. Imagine working the night shift as a security guard in a massive empty office building in Manchester. It is the early hours of November 1st, 2012. Inside, the only sound is the low hum of the servers. The guard on duty is just sipping his coffee, looking at the security monitors, waiting for his shift to end. But then his eyes drift to camera 4. A heavy office chair in an empty cubicle begins to slide backward. It is not just a little vibration. It is a deliberate, steady pull. The guard leans closer, thinking maybe a draft caused it. But the problem was, there were no open vents nearby. And then, paper files start flying off the desks. Computer monitors begin to flicker and sway. Right before his eyes, some unseen powerful force is violently tossing items across the room. He starts frantically switching from camera to camera, watching this invisible entity literally wreck the workspace. This was not a quick glitch. It was a prolonged, aggressive display of physical force captured on tape. And so, we travel across the world to Australia, to the historic Carlisle Castle Hotel. This is an old pub where locals gather for a cold drink after work. One night, the CCTV cameras caught things that could not be explained. In the dining area, a white, transparent figure suddenly appears. It looks like the silhouette of a person, waving its arms slowly in front of the lens. This eerie movement goes on for nearly 30 seconds. Then the video cuts to the bar. The bartender opens the fridge. Right as he does, 2 heavy glass bottles fall out from one of the compartments. Now, the first bottle might have been sitting on the edge, which makes sense. But the second bottle follows right after, flying out at an angle that looks as if it were intentionally pushed by an invisible hand. Minutes later, a glass hanging high above the bar suddenly shatters onto the counter. No one was anywhere near it, it just fell and broke. It turns out the owner wondered if it was a clever hoax, but the staff was left completely terrified. Then we have the strange case of a young woman eating alone in a busy buffet restaurant. She was having a quiet, normal dinner, completely minding her own business. After a while, she stands up from her booth to go grab another plate of food. The surveillance camera is pointed directly at her table. The very second she walks away, the glasses and plates on her table begin to move. They do not just slide a little bit, they literally fly off the edge and crash onto the floor. At this point, the other customers sitting at nearby tables look over in complete shock. Now, if this were a hoax, someone would have had to attach invisible strings to all those dishes without anyone in the busy restaurant noticing. But the reactions of the nearby diners are completely genuine. They look confused and frightened, staring at the empty table, where dishes just decided to jump onto the ground on their own. Let us talk about another place we all visit, the local convenience store. In one video, a shopper is walking down the aisle, looking at the shelves. Suddenly, a small pink object floats out from a shelf right behind his head. At the exact same time, a yellow object of the same size falls off the shelf onto the ground. The man turns around, completely baffled, and picks them up. He looks around to see if anyone is playing a trick, but he is entirely alone in the aisle. Fast forward to the Brookside Theater in Romford. The manager, Jay Seal, came in on a Sunday morning to get things ready for the week. As he walked through the empty auditorium, he noticed one of the heavy chairs in the third row was completely out of line. He decided to check the CCTV footage from the night before. What he saw blew his mind. A chair in the empty room slowly moved backward, completely unassisted. At the same time, a table nearby was pulled across the floor, and strange orbs of light floated through the dark room. Jay later mentioned that he never usually checks the cameras unless there is a major incident. A local medium named Roy Roberts, who had performed at the theater the night before, believed this was clear evidence of a resident ghost who wanted to make its presence known. But things can get much worse. In a hotel dining room in Malaysia, a woman sitting alone saw the chairs around her begin to move on their own. Terrified, she tried to make a run for the exit, but the entity did not want her to leave. As she ran toward the door, a table and several chairs were violently thrown directly into her path, blocking her escape. Another heavy table was flung through the air, striking her and knocking her out cold on the floor. This was an aggressive, physical attack by an unseen force. Some of the most terrifying footage comes from people trying to document these things in their own homes. One YouTuber noticed his dog acting strange, trembling under the bed. The owner took out his camera to record his pet's behavior. He tried to coax the dog out, but the animal was frozen with fear. Suddenly, a loud, heavy knocking sound echoed from the dark attic right above them. The man walked up the stairs, camera in hand, his heart pounding. As he opened the attic hatch, the sheer terror of what he felt made him panic and run back down, completely shaken. When we look at all these cases, we have to ask ourselves a very difficult question. Are these videos just clever hoaxes, or are they real? Some people argue that with enough fishing line, editing software, and good acting, anyone can create a spooky video. But the sheer terror in the eyes of the people experiencing these events is incredibly hard to fake. The way the objects move, the physics of the falling items, and the raw reactions of witnesses suggest that something truly unexplained is happening around us. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, these security recordings offer a chilling glimpse into a world we do not fully understand. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. We all like to think that our homes are the one place where we are completely safe. It is the one space where we can close the door, lock out the rest of the world, and just let our guard down. But sometimes, that safety is nothing more than an illusion. Sometimes the threat does not come from far away. It is right outside your window, or worse, it is already standing inside your room while you sleep. Take the story of a young boy who was only 12 years old when his sense of safety was shattered forever. Today he is 26. But if you ask him about that night, he can still feel the cold sweat on his palms and the absolute terror that gripped his chest. It was a typical weekend, and his parents had planned to go out for the night. This was a big deal because up until that point, he had never been left alone in their large house for very long, let alone after dark. But he was not completely on his own. His parents had left him under the supervision of his 18-year-old brother, Zach. Now, Zach was a typical teenager, and having his parents out of the house meant one thing to him: freedom. Almost as soon as the parents' car pulled out of the driveway, Zach approached his younger brother with a proposition. He told him that he was going to head out for a few hours to hang out with some friends. He looked his little brother in the eye and made him promise, absolutely promise, not to tell their mom and dad. The 12-year-old agreed without hesitation. He trusted his brother completely, and the idea of having this massive house all to himself for a few hours felt like an exciting adventure. He knew that if his parents found out Zach had abandoned him, Zach would get into massive, unforgettable trouble, so he kept the secret. He decided to head down into the family den to watch a scary movie. In hindsight, he admits this was probably the worst decision he could have made. He settled into the couch, the glowing screen of the television casting long, flickering shadows across the room. But as the movie progressed, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. The initial excitement of being alone started to fade, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. It was not just the jump scares on the screen that were getting to him. It was the house itself. When you are home alone at night, every sound is amplified. He started noticing the random, sharp creaks in the wooden floorboards upstairs. He heard the wind brushing against the glass of the windows, sounding like fingernails lightly tapping on the pane. Even the refrigerator in the kitchen periodically clicking on and humming felt incredibly loud and jarring. Every single time the movie made a sudden loud sound, he would flinch, his heart would race, and he would instinctively look over his shoulder. Behind the couch, there was a half flight of open stairs that led straight up to the main floor of the house. Every time he turned around, he fully expected to see someone standing there on the steps, looking down at him in the dark. Eventually, the tension became too much to bear. He decided he was done subjecting himself to this self-inflicted terror. He grabbed the remote, turned off the television, and ran upstairs. He ran like a scared little kid, the kind who believes that if they do not move fast enough, some imaginary monster will grab them from behind the second the lights go out. He made it to his bedroom and quickly went into the attached bathroom. This bathroom connected both his bedroom and his parents' bedroom. He stood in front of the mirror, brushing his teeth as fast as he humanly could, trying to calm his racing heart and convince himself that he was just being paranoid. Once he was done, he went back into his bedroom. To distract his mind from the lingering fear, he booted up his Xbox 360 and started playing Call of Duty Zombies. For a couple of hours, the game worked like a charm. He became completely absorbed in the gameplay, losing track of time as he focused on surviving round after round of virtual enemies. But eventually, his team died, the game ended, and a wave of frustration washed over him. He looked at the digital clock on his screen and realized how late it had gotten. It was definitely time to go to sleep. He shut off the console, climbed into bed, and pulled the covers up. The house was quiet again, but not long after he lay down, he felt a sudden, subtle vibration travel through the frame of the house. It was the distinct sensation of the heavy front door downstairs closing. He immediately let out a quiet sigh of relief, assuming that Zach had finally come back home from his night out. He lay there in the dark, waiting to hear the familiar sound of his brother walking up the stairs to his own bedroom. But Zach did not come upstairs. Instead, the sounds from downstairs continued, and they started to sound very strange. Usually, when Zach came home late, he would quietly slip straight to his room. But whoever was downstairs was moving around the lower level of the house, and they were taking a very long time doing it. The noises were subtle at first. Light, cautious footsteps, strange, indescribable thuds and soft thumps. The 12-year-old felt his stomach start to churn. That lingering fear from the scary movie came rushing back, but this time it felt different. It felt real. He slipped out of bed and crept over to his bedroom window. He looked down into the driveway where Zach usually parked his car. The driveway was completely empty. There was no car there. A cold wave of panic washed over him. At 12 years old, he did not have a cell phone. There was no way for him to call his parents or text Zach to find out where he was. The only phones in the house were landlines, and the nearest one was out in the main hallway. To reach it, he would have to leave his room, step out into the dark, and risk walking straight into whoever was downstairs. It felt completely impossible. He tiptoed over to his bedroom door and gently checked the lock. It was locked, but he knew the lock on his door was incredibly cheap. It was the kind of lock you could easily open from the outside, using nothing more than a fingernail. He looked around his room, his eyes scanning the dark space for any place to hide. The only viable option was a small built-in crawlspace closet set low into the wall of his room. It was tight, cramped, and filled with old clothes, but it was his only option. He squeezed himself inside, pulled the small door shut from the inside, and curled up into a tight ball. He tried to slow his breathing, holding his hands over his mouth to muffle any sound. He desperately prayed that he was just being incredibly paranoid. He kept telling himself that maybe Zach had parked his car on the side of the house instead of the driveway, and that it was just his brother downstairs. But then he heard footsteps coming up the stairs. They were slow, deliberate, and heavy. The footsteps walked down the hallway and stopped right outside his bedroom door. For a few agonizing seconds, there was complete silence. Then, he heard the sound of someone fumbling with the doorknob. There was a metallic click as the lock was easily bypassed. The door slowly creaked open. Someone was now inside his bedroom. The boy sat frozen in the pitch-black crawlspace, his heart hammering against his ribs so hard he was sure the intruder would hear it. Through the cracks of the closet door, he listened to the terrifying sounds of a stranger moving around his personal space. He heard the heavy creak of the floorboards as the person walked around his bed. He could hear dresser drawers being quietly pulled open and things being shifted around. It felt like an eternity was passing, but in reality, it was probably only a matter of minutes. At one point, he heard a heavy scraping sound, like the person was dragging something large and heavy across the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, terrified that the closet door would swing open at any second and reveal him. Eventually, the footsteps began to recede. They moved out of his bedroom and headed back down the hallway, but the boy was too terrified to move. He stayed curled up in that cramped, dark crawl space for what felt like hours. He did not dare to make a sound, fearing the intruder might still be lurking nearby. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of suffocating silence, he heard a voice calling out his name from across the house. It was Zach. Zach's voice did not sound relaxed. It sounded incredibly urgent, tense, and angry. A moment later, Zach burst into his bedroom and called his name again. The boy slowly pushed the crawl space door open and stepped out into his room. The first thing Zach did was raise his voice, demanding to know what he was doing in the closet and why his room was such an absolute mess. It was in that exact moment that the boy had his terrifying suspicion confirmed. It had not been his brother in the house. He quickly explained what had happened, his hands trembling so violently he could barely point toward the door. As the realization sank in for Zach, the two brothers began walking through the house together to inspect the damage. It was far worse than they had imagined. Dresser drawers had been ripped open and emptied. Several expensive electronics, including televisions and gaming consoles, were completely gone. The intruder had systematically cleaned out the house, while the 12-year-old hid just feet away. Zach immediately dialed the police. They waited on edge, checking and rechecking all the doors and windows to make sure they were secure. When the officers arrived, they took a detailed report of the missing items and asked the boys questions about what had happened. They advised them to wait for their parents to return. Around 4 o'clock in the morning, their parents finally arrived. The atmosphere in the house turned incredibly tense. The father was absolutely furious. He walked straight up to Zach and smacked him square across the face for being so incredibly careless, for leaving his young brother home alone, and for leaving the front door unlocked. The mother, on the other hand, rushed over to her younger son, hugging him tightly and expressing how incredibly grateful she was that he was safe. From that night on, Zach's life changed. He was forced to pay monthly rent to his parents to gradually cover the cost of all the stolen items, and he was treated with extreme caution and distrust. The younger brother was not punished at all, but the psychological toll was massive. For years, the memory of sitting in that dark closet, listening to a stranger walk around his bed, would cause his chest to tighten with the exact same panic he felt when he was 12 years old. It is incredibly chilling how quickly a safe environment can turn into a nightmare, but sometimes the threat is not a random burglar. Sometimes, the person you think is a trusted family friend is actually waiting for the perfect moment to strike when you are at your most vulnerable. This was the lesson learned by another child, who was not even old enough to attend kindergarten when they experienced a night of absolute terror. At the time, this young child was living with their grandparents. Their parents had recently separated, and their father worked in a neighboring town, visiting only on weekends. Their uncle, the father's brother, also lived in the house, which meant there was almost always an adult around. Because of this, the child was rarely left truly alone. They lived in a very small, quiet, close-knit town where everyone knew their neighbors. One of those neighbors was a man named David. David was a frequent visitor at the grandparents' house. He was incredibly friendly with both the grandfather and the uncle. He would often come over to sit on the porch, drink a few beers with the uncle, and watch hockey or professional wrestling on the television. He was always willing to help out with yard work, or assist the grandfather with repairs on his truck. If the grandfather came home from a successful hunting trip with a moose, David would be right there, helping him haul the heavy animal into the shed. To the young child, David was just a regular, friendly part of their daily life. But one evening, the child was briefly left home alone. The grandmother was attending a local bingo game, and she had called the house to request a ride home. The grandfather grabbed his car keys and told the child that he was going to go pick her up. He asked if the child wanted to come along for the short drive, but the child refused, preferring to stay on the couch and watch cartoons. Before stepping out the door, the grandfather looked back and gave a strict, familiar warning. He reminded the child never to open the main door for strangers under any circumstances. Then he closed the door and drove away. The moment the truck pulled out of the driveway, the house became profoundly quiet. But only a few minutes later, a loud, heavy knock echoed from the front door. The child, remembering the grandfather's warning, ran up to the closed door and asked loudly who was there. A familiar voice answered from the other side. It was David. The child told David through the closed door that their grandparents were not home. David replied immediately, saying that he knew, because he had just seen the grandfather drive away down the street. The child then said that their uncle was not home either. David responded by saying that he had just been speaking with the uncle on the phone and knew he was out drinking at a friend's house. Then David asked the child to unlock the door and let him inside. The child hesitated, explaining that they were not allowed to open the door for strangers. But David insisted, his voice smooth and persuasive. He said he was not a stranger, that he was their neighbor, and that they already knew him very well. In the mind of a young child, this logic made perfect sense. David was a friend. He was not a stranger. So the child turned the deadbolt and opened the heavy wooden door. David was standing on the porch, towering over the young child. But something was very wrong. He was visibly drunk, swaying slightly on his feet, his speech slurred, and he was squinting with one eye as if struggling to focus. He stepped inside the house and immediately placed his heavy hands on the child's shoulders. The child backed up, but did not feel alarmed quite yet. They had seen their uncle drunk many times before, and figured this was just how adults acted when they had too much to drink. The child politely told David that he could wait in the kitchen while they went back to finish watching cartoons. But David would not let go of their shoulders. His grip tightened, pressing down hard. His demeanor suddenly changed. The friendly neighbor was gone, replaced by someone filled with a quiet, menacing anger. He began speaking in a harsh, frightening tone. Today, the survivor cannot remember the exact words David said, but they will never forget the absolute terror those words inspired. David physically dragged the child into the kitchen. He reached onto the counter, grabbed a large kitchen knife, and pressed the sharp tip of the blade directly against the child's belly. He looked down at them and asked if they wanted to be stabbed. When the child began to cry, David quickly clamped his hand over their mouth, telling them to quiet down, or he would cut their tongue or slit their throat. To prove he was serious, he dragged the dull side of the blade across the child's neck, letting them feel the cold steel against their skin. Just when it felt like the worst was about to happen, the sound of a truck engine rumbled outside. Headlights swept across the kitchen windows. The grandparents' vehicle pulled into the driveway. The car doors slammed shut. A wave of intense relief washed over the child, and they prepared to scream for help. But David quickly clamped his hand even tighter over the child's mouth, turning them both toward the kitchen doorway, just as the grandmother walked through the front door. The grandmother had a warm smile on her face, but the moment she looked into the kitchen and saw David holding her grandchild hostage with a knife, her expression completely vanished. She let out a horrific scream, calling for the grandfather to get inside immediately. The grandfather rushed into the house, his eyes widening in shock and absolute fury as he took in the scene. He did not hesitate. With a roar of pure rage, he charged straight at David. David shoved the child hard, sending them crashing to the kitchen floor. The grandmother rushed over, grabbed the child tightly in her arms, and turned her back to the kitchen, shielding the child's eyes from the violence. She kept whispering over and over that they were safe, but the child could still hear everything. They heard the heavy, brutal sounds of a physical struggle, the crashing of furniture, and the grunts of two grown men fighting. Eventually, the grandfather's physical strength and rage overpowered David. When the grandmother finally let the child look up, the grandfather was physically shoving a bloodied, disheveled David out the front door, shouting at him to never show his face again before slamming the door shut and locking it. As the child grew older, the cold reality of that night began to sink in. David had not shown up by accident. He had deliberately waited for the perfect moment. He knew the uncle was out drinking. He knew the grandmother was at bingo, and he had actively watched the grandfather leave the house. He had planned the entire encounter, targeting a defenseless child, but the story does not end there. Years later, after the grandfather passed away, the survivor was sitting with their grandmother, sharing memories of the man who had protected them. The survivor brought up that terrifying night, praising the grandfather for his heroic actions. But the grandmother's face turned uneasy. She looked down and agreed that it had been a truly terrifying night. Then, she asked the survivor if they remembered what the grandfather did later that same night. The survivor recalled a faint memory of him leaving. The grandfather had claimed he was going hunting. At the time, it had seemed normal, but looking back as an adult, it made no sense. People do not go hunting in the middle of the night unless they are planning an extended camping trip, which the grandfather was not. When the survivor asked the grandmother why he had left, she looked away and claimed she did not remember much about it. This raised a series of incredibly disturbing questions. The family had never called the police that night. No charges were ever filed against David. And from that night on, David was never seen or heard from again. The grandfather was a highly respected member of the community, close friends with local law enforcement, and an expert hunter. If anyone had seen him driving out of town late at night with a large, heavy tarp secured in the back of his truck, no one would have questioned it. The implication was clear, and it left a haunting shadow over the family history. It is terrifying to realize that the monsters we fear are sometimes the people we know, and as we grow into our teenage years, we think we can handle ourselves, but we are often completely unprepared for the darkness that can take hold of the people around us. This was something a 15-year-old boy discovered during his spring break in 2020. He was home alone when he received a desperate call from a school friend named Mason, who begged to drop off their childhood buddy Neil. Neil had been acting strangely at school, claiming basketball coaches were Freemasons, but the narrator did not know the extent of his break. After being offered a weed pen, the narrator agreed to let Neil stay. When they arrived, Mason pulled Neil by the shoulders, crying, and begged him not to do that thing. Neil blankly agreed. Almost as soon as they stepped inside, Neil asked if the doors were locked, forcing the narrator to check. Then, in the hallway, Neil raised his hand and put on an eerie, toothy smile that froze the narrator in place. In the kitchen, Neil went straight to the silverware drawer and reached for a steak knife. Reacting on pure instinct, the narrator grabbed his hand and slammed the drawer shut. Neil simply chuckled as if it were a joke. Terrified, the narrator suggested they walk to the park. He let Neil out first, locked the door behind him, and called his brother. His brother arrived with friends and kept Neil outside. It turned out Neil had been reading a manifesto to Mason, stating he had to kill himself or someone else to prevent his dad from killing him. Neil had taken drugs that triggered severe schizophrenic episodes. The narrator managed to avoid a horrific tragedy by staying on his guard. But perhaps the most unsettling encounters are the ones where we are completely unaware of the danger until it is already staring us directly in the face. This is exactly what happened to a 10-year-old boy named Rad on a warm, sunny afternoon when his mother went grocery shopping. Rad had made a big fuss about staying home instead of going to the store, wanting to enjoy the beautiful weather and shoot some hoops in the street. His mother finally gave in, leaving him alone for a couple of hours. Rad grabbed his basketball from the garage and began playing, completely lost in his own world. But after some time, he stopped to catch his breath. Bouncing the ball lazily against the asphalt, he looked up toward the house, his eyes drifting to his sister's bedroom window on the second floor. There, behind the glass, stood a dark, still silhouette, staring directly down at him. Knowing his sister was away at college and his father was at work, Rad dropped the ball and ran inside to investigate. Standing in the quiet kitchen, he yelled out to ask who was there, his voice cracking with fear. A deep, hollow voice echoed from upstairs, saying, "Rad, come upstairs." Terrified, Rad grabbed the house phone, sprinted outside, and called his mother. She rushed home and called the police, but their thorough search of the house revealed absolutely nothing. Rad felt his mother's growing doubt, but the nightmare was far from over. That night, Rad had trouble sleeping, but eventually drifted off. He woke up in the dead of night to a faint rustling. As his eyes adjusted to the dark, He saw a tall, dark figure standing completely still at the foot of his bed, watching him sleep. Rad let out a blood-curdling scream. The figure immediately bolted across the room, opened the window, and jumped out onto the awning below. He heard the loud, heavy thud of the man's feet hitting the wooden planks of the awning before disappearing into the backyard. His father ran straight to the open window, looking out into the pitch-black night, then raced downstairs in a desperate attempt to catch the trespasser. Rad stood shivering in the middle of his cold room, realizing that this completely unknown and dangerous person had been lurking inside his family house for hours, learning his private name, watching his daily routines, and waiting in the absolute freezing silence of the dark. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.